Welcome to the Open Apple podcast, where we celebrate the Apple II. Whether you're a long-time user, a nostalgic visitor, or a newcomer to the community, join us as we share news and memories of Steve Wozniak's most famous personal computer.
Hello and welcome to Open Apple. This is episode 45 for March 2015. I am your hostess, Quinn Dunkey, and with me as always, my co-host, Mike. How you doing, Mike?
I'm good, Quinn, and you?
I'm fabulous. Apple
You're
II
always
fabulous.
fabulous.
Well, I'm trying to keep up with Carrington.
Yeah, it's a tough job.
It is.
What's going on?
Not very much. Some of our listeners may have noticed we've got exciting new bumpers in our shows.
That's right, yeah.
Thanks very much to my friend Kelly, who is fabulous and has the most amazing voice of anyone I know. Amongst our friends, we joke that we would like to just sit and have her read the phone book to us because she has such an amazing voice. So all the way from Amsterdam. So thank you, Kelly, for recording those new bumpers for us.
Yeah, pretty incredible.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of news to talk about because just the way the schedule is lined up, where we are recording quite a bit after our last show, and this being the amazing Apple II community, there is tons to talk about. So I think we're going to keep this short so that we can get into our interview and roll on into the news. So why don't you set us up there, Mike?
With us, this month we have Mark Kriegsman, and Mark actually reached out to us last month with an email about a really cool project that he was doing with his Apple II, and I did a little bit of research because the name sounded sort of familiar to me. I was like, where have I heard that before? And he wrote Star Blaster for Piccadilly Software and did some other cool Apple II stuff, and we're going to talk to him right now. Hello, Mark.
Hi there. Good to meet you all.
How are you?
I'm doing well. We're surviving the winter in Boston.
Chilly.
Yeah, although by the time this airs, hopefully we'll be well into spring.
Well, with the way I edit, it'll be mid-July or so.
It's funny because it's true.
So, Mark, it looks like you've got a long history with the Apple II. Why don't you start at the very beginning? When did you first lay eyes on one of these machines?
I think I probably first laid eyes on the Apple II around 1979. I was in a summer program for high school students at Trenton State College in New Jersey, and they had some there, and I saw them, and I was hooked right away, particularly because the alternative that they had for us to work on was an IBM 360 mainframe with punch cards and Fortran. And I think I got hooked then. Didn't have one at home, really wanted one, but was able to sort of borrow time on some of my friends' Apple IIs and start learning how to code both in BASIC and then 6502 assembly. And by 1981, I guess I had teamed up with Jeff Engelstein and started working on the game that would become Star Blaster. We published through Piccadilly, who had also published Falcons the previous year. Was I guess I can say now, is a clone of Phoenix, the arcade game. Of course, back then we had to, pretend that there was no relationship at all between these things. In 1982, we published Star Blaster, and I was the happiest 16-year-old on the block at that point.
You were 16? Oh man!
Another one. Wow. We've been talking a lot lately about how young a lot of these game makers were at the time, and we had no idea. So I guess we can add you to the list.
Yeah, I was. Jeff was a couple years older, and I guess I was the youngest of the group there at Piccadilly. Piccadilly was essentially a software publishing entity that grew out of the local computer store that was selling apples and pets and so on. A bunch of the young folk in the area had taken to writing games for fun, and the guys who ran the computer shop saw an opportunity there and started up Piccadilly Software to publish all the games that we were putting out. And I guess in total there were about 5 or 6 that came out of Piccadilly over a couple of years.
And you worked on all of them?
No, Jeff and I worked on Star Blaster in particular. I was in the room while a bunch of the other ones were under development, but I definitely don't get title credit on any of those. It was more swapping code fragments and help me get the bird's feet looking green in this image, and how do I debounce the game button and that kind of stuff. So a lot more sharing techniques and code than sort of being principal authors on any of the other ones.
Did you ever regret not taking up Fortran on punch cards?
Well, Now, you notice that I didn't say that I didn't take up Fortran on punch cards, because I did take up Fortran on punch cards in addition to the Apple II, the Basic, and the 6502. And in fact, I still have a bunch of those Fortran punch cards, and every now and then somebody at work will make some derogatory comment about Fortran, and I will pull out one of these cards and wave my code at them and say, "You just back off."
So when you get nostalgic, do you type in some code on the Apple II and then come back tomorrow and hit run?
As I was doing the project that we'll get to in a minute, I guess, I did set up an Apple IIe on my dining room table with a monitor and the whole deal. And my daughter Eleanor, who's 12, looked at the thing like it was from outer space. And this was a IIe, and turned it on, and I showed her how to do some basic programming on it. And I said, of course, this wasn't my oldest computer. My oldest computer was an Apple II Plus. And I say it was so old that it didn't come with lowercase letters, and they cost extra, and I couldn't afford it. And again, she looked at me like I had three heads. You're like, how can a computer not have lowercase letters? But
it's funny. It's one of those things that's really hard to explain to people nowadays. That lowercase letters cost extra because ROM was really expensive, and there just wasn't room for all of those letters.
Right, and instead we got what would later become the HTML blink tag.
Yeah, exactly.
We got flashing.
I think I have something like 8,000 fonts on my computer right now, but at the time, lowercase letters did cost extra.
Right.
But the best thing about the Apple II, coming from where you came from, is that when you drop a floppy disk, your code doesn't scatter across the floor. You just pick it up and put it back in.
The lines of code stayed in order. Yeah, that was...
When I was in school, we were just sort of past that era, but our professors were from the punch card era, and they all had this sort of 1,000-yard stare when you asked them what it was like to drop a box of the punch card. It's like being in Nam, I think.
I found out later, so I was a student when I was doing this, but I found out later that professional programmers who were using punch cards they had a special program that would number the cards and would repunch a new deck of cards essentially with line numbers on them. And if they ever dropped the deck, they could then reload it into the mainframe and run a sort program. And while it wouldn't sort the old cards, it would punch a new set of cards in order again.
Ah, that's really clever.
Yeah. So that was a problem, and lo and behold, engineers had a solution to it.
A very slow, expensive solution, but a solution nonetheless.
And that's why you get that 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah, I suppose the lower budget folks just wrote numbers on the corners of the cards with a pencil so that they could sort them by hand if they ever had to.
Yeah, I think the academic solution is you hand it to your grad student and say, "Here, fix this."
There you go. I like that. Yeah, it's like that old saw about how NASA spent millions of dollars developing a pen that would write upside down and in space, and the Russians just used a pencil.
Yeah, exactly. So I did do a little bit of Fortran on punch cards back in the day, but really the Apple II was what grabbed my attention because it just seemed like you could have a lot more fun with it. I was a student at the time, and it was exactly what I wanted to be doing. And publishing these games through Piccadilly was a blast because here my friends are flipping burgers at the local joint. I'm slaving away in a dark room in front of a screen, and nobody knows what's going on, except suddenly a year later, I get a royalty check, which probably, was equivalent to the same amount that they'd earned in the equivalent amount of time flipping burgers, except that the next month I got another one. And it went on like that for a little while, which was great, and was, I'm going to say, probably my first entrepreneurial activity. I've gone on subsequently. I've started a couple of companies. I look back, and this sense that, in those days, anybody who wanted to could just kind of dig in and do it, I think definitely shaped the way I think about business and personal endeavors these days.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. The barrier to entry for software developers was so low at the time. And then it got really, really high for a long time, and it hasn't come back down again since mobile. Anybody can now pick up and develop, an Android or an iPhone game. And so we're kind of back to that point. But yeah, for 30 years there, the barrier to entry just seemed to keep getting higher and higher and higher. You needed more and more expensive equipment and more, fancy software and education and so on to do it. So it's funny to see it coming back down again.
There's also this sort of vibrant community around microcontroller developers, people doing programming on Arduino. And once again, we see a lot of open source libraries, but also, the barrier there to just kind of go and get the equipment and get started with it and see what you can do, the barrier is very low again. And I think a lot of people have fun tinkering at almost at the hardware level with it.
Yeah, definitely. I think, we've talked about this on the show as well, that we're in a real renaissance of kind of hacking. And, nowadays they call it the maker movement. But there's just so many great sort of hardware development boards, available that are so approachable, so easy to use, and so well documented that it's just really a lot of fun for anyone to do. And one of my big, proverbs that I always throw at people is that if you're playing with an Arduino, then you should play with a retro computer, because they're the same thing, but more fun because they have cool graphics and sound and, keyboards and stuff. So, an Arduino is just an Apple II with no keyboard or video circuit. So, and that's, which of course leads us right into your project, which is what I love so much about it, because here you are doing exactly this thing that I'm always telling people to do. So why don't you tell us about your project?
Okay, so I sort of describe it to people this way: is back in the day, I hacked on the Apple II, and that was where I did all my geeky tinkering. These days, I am the co-author with Daniel Garcia of a library for Arduino and ARM-based microcontrollers called FastLED. That's a library that lets you hook up one of these microcontrollers to a long string of intelligent programmed LEDs, RGB LEDs, and do all kinds of animations and patterns and designs. And people do wearable electronics with it, and people do home decoration, and people do holiday decorations with it. And we put a lot of time and energy and love into this library, and we support a lot of different microcontroller boards and a lot of different LED strip protocols. And at some point I started thinking, it would be cool if I could somehow fuse these two worlds, the one that I'm in now of microcontrollers and intelligent LEDs, and the Apple II world that I remember. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought exactly what you said, which is, as you said, the Arduino is an Apple without a screen or keyboard. So conversely, the Apple is an Arduino with a screen and keyboard. So if we can do this on the Arduino, why can't we do it on the Apple? And I suddenly remembered, hey, the game connector port on the back gives me, some TTL level outputs. There's no reason we can't program those to send the serial commands to the LED strips. And lo and behold, not only is it possible, but I did it. And, basically treating the Apple II as a microcontroller that happens to have, 4 digital inputs. We would normally call those the push button inputs. 4 analog inputs, that's the joystick inputs, and 4 digital outputs, which are the annunciator lines that I think nobody ever did anything particularly interesting with back in the day. And turns out actually there's a 5th digital output that's available, not on the 2GS, but on the 2 and the 2 Plus and the 2E, which is there's a strobe line that's also available on the game connector port. So how this project all comes together goes like this. You take your Apple II and you take one of these long strips of intelligent LEDs. Sometimes they get called neopixels, and you draw power from somewhere else because you don't want to draw 4 amps of power out of your Apple. But then you plug the data and clock lines from the LED strip into a couple of output pins on the game connector port, and you load up the special version of FastLED called FastLED 6502, and you can then program beautiful 24-bit RGB animations for the LED strip that's being powered by your Apple II. because I'm a bit of an assembly language speed freak, we were able to get up to about 30 frames a second on 100 RGB LED pixels, which I feel pretty good about that, considering that it's a 1 megahertz machine driving it. So we did this, and normally our user community in the FastLED world is used to using ARM chips and Arduino boards, and we said, oh yeah, and by the way, we're announcing support for one new platform, the Apple II. And people kind of fell out of their chair and said, have you gone back in time here? And we said, well, the machine had those capabilities even then. It's just a question of waiting for somebody to tap it and connect it to the right things. As far as I can tell, so far nobody but me has actually stood it up and got it running. I'm waiting to hear back from the first other user of this code to say, yeah, I dug my Apple II out of my basement, I hooked up the LEDs, and I have this gorgeous rainbow scrolling around them.
Quinn.
Well, unfortunately, I absolutely adore this, and I love the pictures that you sent. We'll share those in the show notes as well. Unfortunately, my only Apple II that I have here in my house is a 2C, so it has the external game port that doesn't have all of these same pins that the internal one does on the 2E and 2 Plus. But I absolutely adore this project, and I'm sure that some of our listeners will definitely try this out. We'll certainly be linking to all the relevant things in the show notes so that people can try this out themselves.
Cool. I'm excited about that. The other thing that came up as we were doing this is these LEDs talk essentially an SPI protocol or a modified SPI. And there's a lot of other devices out there that talk SPI protocol. There are Wi-Fi adapters that talk SPI, which suddenly opens up all kinds of interesting opportunities. And I think it's just that a lot of people haven't thought about the game port essentially as being, like microcontroller I/O pins. But that's what it is. And so, anything you can hook up to an Arduino, you can probably drive off the game port too.
Yeah, definitely. That's part of why, I've been harping on this on the show is that, there are things like that, these TTL level inputs and outputs that are just sitting there. And, people go to great lengths to get such features in modern machines. The big selling point of the Raspberry Pi is that it's a modern computer with GPIO. But, computers all had that for a long time. We just have to go and dig them out of the closet. So I'm really happy to see this. We did have at KansasFest this year, we had a father and son team who did a bunch of interesting things with the game port. They did a similar thing where they built kind of a GPIO setup off of it, and they launched some bottle rockets, and they had a roller coaster that was driven off of it. So they did some really fun demos at KFest with that stuff. So any thoughts of bringing this setup to KansasFest to show people?
So, obviously I've been a part of the Apple II community for a long time, although I took a little break there in the middle.
Many of us did.
It's interesting. I even published something in the middle of taking the break in the late 80s. Jeff and I had built a second video game that we didn't publish through Piccadilly just because we were both busy with college and other stuff. But after we'd both graduated from college, I realized I still had this thing on the shelf, and I guess this is 1989. And at that point, there was kind of a declining market for new Apple II software, but SoftDisk was always looking for new material. So in 1989, we published a second game through SoftDisk, although we probably hadn't worked on it in 5 years. And that was called Panic Button, which was one large game that had about 30 little mini games in it. Jeff has gone on to become a board game designer, and his, among other things, and one of his latest creations has a whole bunch of mini games in it. And I go, where'd that come from?
Do you know the names of any of his games by any chance? I'm a big board gamer also, actually.
Space Cadets and Space Cadets Dice Duel, and there's a whole family there, and he's getting some success with it. Okay,
great. I'm going to look those up.
The one other thing that was sort of an aha and final completion of the journey for me about this project was ever since I'd been poring over the Apple II technical reference manuals and, reading every detail, what can I do with this, what can I do with that? And I remember seeing that strobe output on the game port and thinking, why the heck would you ever want a 1 clock cycle long pulse coming out the game port? I can't light an LED with that. I can't do anything. Fast forward 25 years or something like that, and I'm thinking about hooking up these SPI style lights, and suddenly I go, wait a minute, I can use that strobe to run the clock line on the RGB LEDs. And because when you hit that address, the C040, it pulses down and back up in one cycle. It gives you a faster pulse than if you had to set one of the annunciators low and then high again. And part of the way we were able to get the frame rate so high is because finally we're using that strobe line for something. So I had this sense of, aha, finally now I, finally come around to understand the electrical engineering issue here and like, what can we use it for? It felt good to finally, say, now I've used every part of this thing.
That's very cool. Yeah, I think at the time some people used the strobe line. There was these joystick multiplexers that you could get that would let you hook up 2 joysticks to the Apple II, which of course you couldn't normally do because there was only a single joystick took up both paddles. But the strobe line was useful there because you could then multiplex the joysticks because you could synchronize with this box to sample the joysticks alternately, and then you would know which joystick you were reading because you could strobe it. But I suspect that's what that got used for in some cases anyway. So it's very cool to see. This is the kind of thing that we like to talk about in the show, how, Woz was very big on open architecture and expandability and hackability. And, here we are 30, 40 years later, and we're still receiving the dividends of those decisions, because here we are still, playing with these machines, whereas other machines would not be so interesting to play with if he hadn't put all this kind of stuff into it.
There's almost like you could say it's an open Apple.
Yeah. It's a good name for a podcast. I wonder if that's taken.
Check that out.
Yeah, I think we're going to call this show 1 megahertz because we know that name's gone idle. There's definitely nothing using that.
Oh no!
A lot of people asked me when they saw this thing running. They said, so this Apple II, is it faster or slower than an Arduino? And I was like, how do I explain this? And I said, well, the Arduino is 16 megahertz and this is 1. I said, but there's architectural differences too. Like, for example, the 6502 is, and you'll all forgive me for this, is so slow that even a no-op takes 2 cycles to execute. And people looked at me and said, really? And I was like, oh yeah, not only that, it was state-of-the-art at the time. We loved it, so.
Well, I think if someone asks you, is an Arduino faster or slower, I think the answer is yes. Because, the Apple II is much better at some things, but much worse at others. So, yeah, there's
Absolutely.
Definitely it's sort of apples and oranges, so to speak.
Oh.
It's like comparing apples and Arduinos, really.
Oh, boo.
All right, I'm not bringing my A game tonight. Sorry, folks. Should just stick to the Commodore jokes, apparently. So, anything else you want to talk about on FastLED?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think we're, as I said, we normally port it to, bigger and better and faster machines, and we look at the Pi and things like that. But I think there's a lot of fun to be had sort of bringing the Arduino aesthetic back to the retro computing world and, hooking up new devices to the old machines and making it all fly.
You are going to show up in July in Kansas City at KansasFest to show us all this, right?
I got to say, for the first time ever, I'm considering making the pilgrimage. So you just may see me out there.
We'll look forward to that.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I have to say, anybody who would build this definitely belongs at KansasFest. You are guaranteed to have a good time.
Or locked up.
Yes. Should be locked up at KansasFest.
That's right.
So in between there, between Star Blaster and this FastLED, there was a big chunk of time there. Were you using any Apple II type of stuff in between there, or did it just go in the closet that whole time?
Well, certainly it went in the closet, and maybe I have more Apple II hardware than I should. It was interesting sort of dragging it all out and dusting it off and seeing if I could put together, one working system that I could get to do the development for this on. And at first I thought I was going to do all the development natively on the machine, using, the tool chains that I had used before. And
that always sounds like a good idea at the time.
So, yeah, it does, exactly. And then I realized things like, well, I'm also going to have to find some floppy disks to use, and the newest ones I could find were manufactured 20 years ago, so not that I had any concerns about media integrity. But the keyboard on the machine that I wanted to use, a couple of the keys didn't work, and they were keys like R and P and the space bar and return. And I was like, this is going to be challenging without return. I mean, I could type Control M, but
that's hardcore.
That gets old pretty quickly. But it worked well enough that it was able to hook it up with a serial card and USB converter. And I have to admit, I did a bunch of the development in emulator on my MacBook and then pushed the code over and ran it there.
Sure.
And somebody pointed out that I believe it was you, Quinn, who said that make install is too verbose by itself.
Yep.
And that you should set it up so that just when you build, it automatically puts it into the disk image. Yep. The difference is when you're actually connecting to the hardware, you can't do the testing in the emulator. So I actually had to push the code over every time because it was actually connected to the LED hardware on the physical Apple II. So my dining room table has taken over with all kinds of equipment for a while. and of course,
I'm glad. I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because, well, first of all, let me say that there's no shame in developing on an emulator. As much as I love the vintage stuff, I do all of my development on an emulator as well, and then test on hardware later, just because once you get used to 30-inch screens and code completion and multiple window editors and so on, it's just you can't go back.
And advanced technologies like cut and paste.
Yes, exactly. But having said that, I've actually been considering a build pipeline that would put the code directly into RAM on the real machine, something along the lines of what ADT Pro does. And I'm sure it's possible. It would just be a case of setting up the tools in just the right way, probably using the same serial port input trick that ADT Pro does. And you might have to run a small client app on the Apple II, but that would allow you to put your code straight into RAM and not have to do anything with, transferring disk images back and forth or anything like that. So that might be something to do as well.
It's a great idea. I love the idea of pushing over essentially the hex dump of the code and just executing it directly. So my dining room table wound up covered in all the hardware as I was taking apart all these different machines, trying to find all the right pieces so that I had one complete working system and drives that could read each other's floppy. I mean, none of this is news to you. But and of course, so I went through this whole thing, including the ordeal with some of the keys not working and everything, and finally got all the way to the end and realized I had it all working, but that the only reason that the keyboard hadn't been working was that the cable had come loose. And reached underneath and plugged it back in, and everything was fine. I can't say I regret using the emulator to do the development, but I kind of wish I'd been able to do the entire thing just sitting in front of the machine like back in the old days.
Like I say, I think the nostalgia of that wears off pretty quick when you're just trying to get things done. You're waiting for the floppy drives
absolutely. And so when we did the games in 1981 and 1982, 1983, of course everything's copy protected, and the way that was implemented then was you write your own disk I/O routines. Lovingly handcrafting the nibble streams going to the disk controller and this kind of stuff. But I remember spending hours and hours and hours and hours debugging that code. And, the first time recently, when I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to write some new code, and I looked at one of these emulators and the fact you could stop it and look at the registers, and you could tinker with it and then say, okay, back up, no, go again, and everything. I said, oh my God, what I would have killed for that then.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's really about efficiency. I mean, especially as we get older and we have, so much less free time than we used to. Emulators like Virtual 2, I really love developing in that just because it's got that whole debug interface where you can, stop and step through code and look at memory, and it's got the little tricks you can do to make it reboot instantly and not have to wait for the floppy disk to reload Protoss every time and things like that. Because like for example, I've recently been developing some interrupt code, and every time anything goes wrong, you have to reboot because every tiny little mistake brings the machine down in a horrible state, and there's nothing you can do to recover. So you spend a lot of time rebooting, and so if I had to be then loading ProDOS and opening Merlin and loading up my source code and then just trying to figure out what went wrong every single time, I mean that's
I'm
just
getting older just listening to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the iteration time is so brutal. I can't even imagine, doing that nowadays with such little free time. So yeah, compared to doing that on an emulator where you can just bang through your iterations, dozens of them, in an hour. So, yep, it's about getting things done, I'm afraid, as much as the nostalgia is neat.
It was good when it was all said and done that plugged the keyboard back in properly and it all worked, But as I say, I don't really regret using the emulator along the way.
Yeah, and there is still something, there's a magical moment. I've recently been testing a software project that I've been developing on an emulator on my real hardware, and there is something magical about that. I mean, as long as you're developing it in the emulator, it just feels like desktop software. It feels a bit like developing an iPhone app or something because everything is on your MacBook Pro or whatever. And so when you see that same code running for real on real hardware, that is still pretty magical, actually.
Yeah, and this actually that connects partly back to why I like doing the LED animations, either using microcontrollers or now my Apple, which is before this you can say, oh, I wrote a beautiful program, but in order to see the beauty of the program, you're still sort of looking at the screen, and by getting onto a spray of dozens or hundreds or thousands of colored LEDs, you've escaped the screen and you're kind of out in the middle of the room, or you're on somebody's hat or what have you. And it is magic when you say, you're no longer just staring at the screen. You're transcended that a little bit.
Yeah, hardware is pretty great that way. It's a different kind of experience to see something you've built controlling, external hardware versus just seeing something on the screen, for sure.
I have to ask, what's this interrupt project that you have?
Well, you'll just have to come to KansasFest and see. That's where I'm revealing it. So.
And now she sets the hook. Okay.
That's right. I've been tight-lipped about it all year on this podcast. So you're just going to have to come to KFest and see.
All right, consider me officially lured. Now we'll see if we can make all logistics work.
Excellent.
When I was a kid, one of the things that my dad brought home was an X10 kit. So I had a lot of fun experimenting with the programming the lights and the various home accessories to my mother's great annoyance. But there's, like you said, Quinn, there's definitely a kind of a next step feel to actually having things react in the real world to what you're doing on the Apple II, as opposed to just seeing the pixels light up on the screen. Not that that's not exciting too.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned that. I mean, there was X10 stuff for the Apple II back in the day, and you can still get it. It does come up on eBay occasionally. And X10 did become sort of a de facto standard, so it still works today. You can still buy X10 stuff. So it would still be possible, definitely, to set up your Apple II to do your home automation now if you wanted to, which is actually something I have considered. It's on the backlog of projects that I will never have time for, but there are, of course, more modern systems now. There's things like Insteon and Wemo and so on, more modern home automation standards, but X10 does still work.
Now I have to go into my basement and dig that up.
Do you have one of the original X10 Apple II interfaces?
Yeah, I still have the whole set. There's the interface and then the various attachments for the accessories.
Oh, very cool.
I've got all that.
Oh, you have
stored away.
You have to dig that up then. That's neat. You could bring it to KFest and control the lamp in your room.
Just annoy my roommate.
That's right.
I think that I had some of that back in the day, and I remember at one point plugging the Apple into one of the appliance modules and then writing a program to turn that module off.
Turn itself off? That's excellent.
I couldn't get it to turn back on for some reason. But...
Are you familiar with those things called the most useless machines?
Yes.
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's a little hobby project you can build. There's plans for them online, and it's a box with a switch on it, and you flip the switch, and a little lid on the box opens, and some sort of robotic finger comes up and turns the switch off again. And so they call it the most useless machine because all it does is turn itself back off again. And when done correctly, it's actually, the idea is that there's no external power source. So it really is turning itself off just using some sort of latent energy that was still there as the switch went off. So either using some sort of capacitor or some sort of mechanical energy or something like that. So that's funny because you sort of made the most complex possible useless machine.
You're right. That's what this thing did, was it reached out and turned itself off.
There was a company called, I think it was called Thunderware, and they made a Thunderware clock interface for the Apple II, but they made a version called, I think it was the Thunderclock Plus, that also had the X10 interface. So if you had that, because it had the clock, you could program things would happen later on in the day. And I always wanted one of those so that I could mess with my mom when I wasn't there.
I remember the Thunder Clock. I didn't know the company that made that was called Thunderware, which, can I just say, is a bit of an unfortunate name for a company. I'm going to hazard a guess they didn't focus test that one very much. I hope it is called Thunderware because that makes me laugh.
Somebody needs to resurrect that name.
Yes. I can only imagine the corporate logos. I hope they have a line of music composition software called the Tire Track.
Oh, no.
All right, we'll just wrangle that right back in before we lose our family rating on iTunes.
Well, I want to say thank you very much for having me on to talk about the FastLED 6502. And as I said, I'm still really looking forward to getting the first pictures from somebody else who's gotten it stood up and running. And anybody has any problems, I'm happy to help out.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for showing it to us. This just hits the sweet spot for us. We love things that do something new and modern with the Apple IIs. So we'll put out an official call to our listeners right now. Listeners, someone out there, go and try this and send pictures in to us, and we will pass them on to Mark and post them for everyone else to see.
The gauntlet has been thrown down.
That's right. I have thrown it. It is down.
Thank you very much.
Well, we got a lot of news to talk about, don't we, Mike and Mark?
Yes, we
also
do. My goodness, so we'll just roll right on into that.
It may be old, but there's still news. Apple II news.
So I think the first item is mine, so I'm just going to dive right in. We've been talking quite a bit recently about Chris Torrance's book, Assembly Lines, and it's, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a sort of a reprint / edition of lost articles, I guess, of all of Roger Wagner's Assembly Lines articles. And it's a really wonderful read. I'm really enjoying it. And I think there's an Easter egg in it. And I might be crazy, but someone else can maybe confirm this. There seems to be a flip book in the corner of the pages that is the Apple II cursor, the square bracket and the blinking cursor prompt. If you look down in the corner and you do flip the pages like a flip book, it makes the blinking Apple II cursor. Maybe I'm imagining that, but it sure seems to be there.
Crap, now I'm looking around for my copy of it. Because I want to check that right now. Yeah,
it's pretty neat. It's possible that I'm making that up, but it sure seems like it to me. I don't think it's an accident. There is there's a cursor prompt in the corner of every page, and some of the pages the cursor's not there, and some of them it is. So I think that's what it's supposed to be, is a flip book. So well done, Chris.
I think that's the first mention I've seen of that.
Yeah, all right. Breaking news. You heard it here first. Open Apple, the podcast of record.
ITworld.com has an article, and I'm sure this is all over pretty much every tech blog, so I don't know if they're the original source for this or not, but the source code for the original Microsoft Basic for 6502 has been published, and you can go browse that right now. Microsoft's gig, I'm sure everybody listening to the show already knows this, but for the one or two of you that might not, before they were, the Windows company and the Office company, they made operating systems. They licensed BASIC and I think Xenix and a couple of other programs to pretty much every hardware maker out there, including Apple. So if you pop the cover off your Apple II, you will see a copyright Microsoft 1977 notice on the PCB itself. But the source code's out there now, and you can take a look. I don't know if this was sanctioned or not, but at this point, I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, it's not entirely clear where this came from, and it's kind of neat as a historical artifact just because, Bill Gates actually wrote it. But of course, to Apple II users, it's kind of old news. The source code for AppleSoft Basic, which is basically this, if you'll pardon the pun, has been around for a long time. And in fact, we'll talk about that later in the show. But the commonly available AppleSoft Basic source code listings are quite a bit better than this one. They're better annotated and better referenced. So this is kind of a neat piece of history, but certainly not very useful or exciting to Apple II users. To those of us who are developing with AppleSoft Basic internals, it's kind of old hat.
You're saying that Bill didn't adequately comment his code?
You know what? I am not going to say anything to disparage Mr. Gates. Because
he listens, you know that.
Yes, I'm sure he listens to the show, and he has enough money to do anything he wants. So there is therefore right about everything and awesome.
All right, what do we have next here? Filming on the Jobs movie. Well, this is old news by now. I think this kind of broke the end of January that they had started filming on the second Jobs movie. This was the project that was written by Aaron Sorkin and started at Sony and moved over to Universal Pictures. And when it moved over to Universal, Woz did not move with the project, so he was no longer consulting, but I think they probably got everything they needed out of him by then anyway. And the articles, I guess they started at the garage, the famous or infamous garage, which actually was sort of debunked recently and said, the garage really wasn't that important to us. So I imagine that was probably, we've got the script written already and this is what we're filming. So more recently, they were filming over at De Anza College at the Flint Center where the original Macintosh was revealed in 1984. And there was a casting call actually for extras, and I guess thousands of people showed up for this thing. And there's a tongue-in-cheek article over on CNET that said, I almost met one of the extras on the Jobs movie. So I thought that was kind of funny. Cult of Mac has an article that's kind of the meet the cast. So Jobs is going to be played by Michael Fassbender, and at least the pictures that I've seen, there's not a lot of physical resemblance there, but everything I've seen Fassbender do has been really great, so I imagine that probably won't be a problem. Kate Winslet has been cast as Joanna Hoffman. Cult of Mac describes her as the former Apple PR queen. And obviously, we talked about Seth Rogen being Woz and kind of questioned that, Woz wasn't always the sort of rotund, jolly guy that he is now, and whether Rogen would make a good choice for that. But the publicity shots that I've seen so far, he actually kind of, he slimmed back down some like he did for, Green Hornet. So he actually looks pretty good. Jeff Daniels is playing John Scully, and there's a real physical resemblance there.
Yeah, that's a good casting, that one.
Yeah. Someone named Catherine Waterston is playing Chrisanne. I don't know what she's been in. Oh, she had a breakout role in the Oscar-nominated film Inherent Vice. Michael Stolbarg is playing Andy Hertzfeld. And let's see, there are 3 different actresses that will be playing the young Lisa Jobs at various points in her life. They are Perla Hanny Jardine, Ripley Sobo, and Mackenzie Moss. I don't know any of them. A very Emma Stone-looking Sarah Snook will be playing the legendary Apple PR woman, Andy Cunningham. She did all the PR for the Macintosh. And Adam Shapiro will be playing I don't know how to pronounce that, Tavanian, who worked with Jobs at Next because it's a bio of Jobs. It also talks about his years away from Apple. So should be interesting to see. And I think they now have a release date of like September or October this year.
Yeah, and since they've cast Seth Rogen as sort of the later version of Woz, and they bothered to cast Jobs' daughter, I think that says a lot about the sort of time period that they intend to cover. This is clearly more of the later portion of Jobs' career. It's probably going to be a lot of iPod and iPhone stuff and not so much Apple II stuff, but that's a bit unfortunate, I think.
Well, from our perspective, yeah.
Well, I mean, we're biased, obviously. So I wanted to circle back actually a little bit. I wanted to ask Mark, what's the interface for FastLED? We were talking about the Microsoft Basic source code. Is there an AppleSoft Basic interface to your library, or have there been thoughts of writing one?
Thoughts of writing one, yes. That does not exist yet. Right now, it's an assembly interface. It comes with one demonstration that does a sort of swirling rainbow around the LEDs. But clearly, the right thing to do Part one would be to write a sort of ampersand interface, so you could call it from AppleSoft Basic. But the other thought I've had is, and if I felt like sinking some money into this, to actually make a 40 pixel by 40 pixel wall size array of these LEDs and write a routine that screen scrapes the low-res screen and mirrors it onto the wall of LEDs so you could play Lemonade Stand.
That would be amazing. That would be an amazing KFest project, I think, is what.
That would be, that would be fun. And then what I do is just, make it some way that I can just roll it up and put it in a tube and take it with me.
Yeah. The dream of a flexible display on the Apple II.
Right. Right now, the interface is assembly. It's essentially a library intended to be linked into other people's assembly code, which is, in a lot of ways, what we did with the 6502 version mirrors the way it works as an Arduino library, which is you're writing your code, and this is just a library used to get it done.
Right.
But on the Apple, it's a little bit different, and we do have the graphic screen, and we can play with that. So
yeah.
there may yet be future development here.
Very cool. I love the idea of, using the low-res screen as an interface. That's fantastic. I could also send you some code for parsing the ampersand command line type stuff. That's actually quite easy to do. It's a little bit tedious to set it up the first time, but I could send you some code if you wanted to do that.
I have to admit I've forgotten how to do that. Back in, I guess, 1981, I wrote some code that did that. I sent it to Bob Sander-Siedloff, who had the Apple Assembly Lines newsletter. He published some of that code then. There's an AppleSoft routine called getVar and some other things in there, but it's all hazy. I'd love to have it.
The ampersand part is easy enough. Yeah, it's just a vector. But then, the messy part is having to parse all of the AppleSoft tokens and so on to figure out what the user wants to do. But there's some good code out there. I would also recommend looking at Michael Mahon's NotaNet. He's got a really nice ampersand interface for that. And I looked at his code quite a bit when I was writing mine. He's got quite an elegant implementation of that.
I'll take a look at that. One of the things that's funny is, sort of the interface layer here is these LEDs are 24-bit color. Each LED can display 16 million different colors. And there's not a pixel anywhere in this Apple II that has anything like that number of colors on it.
Nope, the Apple II would dream of such fidelity. The 2GS can't even do that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's clearly some impedance mismatch there that has to be dealt with in code. But there's a lot to do. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity, and I'd love to do a large low-res screen. We'll see how time and resources work out on that.
All right. Well, I mentioned NotaNet. Speaking of networking Apple IIs, David Schmenk has been quite busy, as he often is. He's built what appears to be an Apple II web server. Now, there isn't a lot of information about this, unfortunately. His website has some tantalizing photos and not a lot of other information. So we can tell from this that it's probably running off Plasma, which is his own language that he's written for the Apple II, and is, of course, famously being used as the game scripting language in Lawless Legends. It's a very cool thing. And he appears to be serving a website to his iPad from the Apple II. And this is all deduced from a screenshot. So has anyone else heard any more information about this?
So I took a look at that website, and he's using an interface module called a WizNet 5100 to do the heavy network lifting there.
Okay.
So I feel like, again, he's kind of borrowing from the Arduino world, the microcontroller world, and it's exciting. It, again, makes me think that there's a lot that could be done hooking up sort of contemporary microcontroller things to the Apple II. I recently saw a new Wi-Fi module for embedded systems called an ESP8266, which is a little thing. It's about $5, and on one side of it has basically a serial interface, and on the other side of it can join your Wi-Fi network and can do all kinds of internet comings and goings. And people are starting to do very interesting things with that, especially because it's so low cost.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, I've seen that. That thing has been all, the hacking blogs and so on have been all a Twitter, so to speak, about that thing.
Oh,
And yeah, it was because for a long time there was no inexpensive way to get to get a Wi-Fi stack and just add it to something like an Arduino or a microcontroller. And yeah, now there's this thing that came out of China, and for a while nobody knew how to use it. They just knew it was a Wi-Fi stack on a chip with no drivers or anything. And then people, built up tools for it, and so now suddenly it's this panacea. You can add Wi-Fi to anything for $5. So it's only a matter of time till someone does it on an Apple II if they haven't already.
And the thing is so small that you could actually mount that on a 16-pin dip header and just drop it into the game port. So
That's true.
So there's a potential here for sort of the no slot clock except Wi-Fi.
The no slot Wi-Fi. I love it.
Nice.
So you're going to do that for KFest too, right?
We could sell dozens.
That's right. Yeah, maybe 2 dozen. That's dozens
if you
plural.
advertise it right, yeah, you might get up to 30.
Yeah, if you bring them all to KFest, you would probably sell out.
So I have to say, this is the kind of project where, it's like the LED one, which is honestly, if even one person does it and gets a kick out of it, then it's worth it.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, with the Apple II, any kind of project that you do, we're way, way into the territory of you better love doing it and not count on anyone else ever using it for anything. Because, again, unless you bring it to KFest where all of the remaining Apple II users will be, we certainly can't count on making anything out of it. All right. Well, Mike, looks like CiderPress is in the news again. Why don't you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so a couple of months ago, we talked about how after, I think the previous version, 3.01, is about 6 years old now. There was finally some movement to bring it to a more modern Windows interface because there were a few little bugs and things like that. And beta version was out for people to play with, and that has now gone final. And there are some significant changes there in the UI and usability. There's some bug fixes and some internal stuff. This is all going to be, we'll have the specifics in the show notes here. The Newlib 2, which is the command line interface that sort of goes along with CiderPress, has also been updated to version 3.0, and that was just kind of more code refresh. I don't know that there's any new features or anything like that. If you're a Mac type and you don't like Windows, this still works just fine under Wineskin. If you're willing to do a little configuration in there, you can get that running under Mac as well, which is kind of a neat thing because I think CiderPress, even 10 or 12 years later, is still the most useful Apple II disk image manipulation tool out there.
Yeah, it really is. I was looking into this a little bit. I keep meaning to set up CiderPress. I'm still using Apple Commander, the Java-based command line tool for manipulating disk images. But CiderPress, I didn't even honestly know that some of the stuff it does. I mean, it'll read AppleWorks GS files and, all kinds of crazy stuff that, makes it really quite a remarkable tool.
So that's available now, and we'll, like I said, have the link in the show notes to download that.
Mark, have you delved into making disk images yet or ripping disks?
So there's a pile of suspicious-looking floppies in my basement, which I have not yet jumped into. The build process that I did for the LED project did involve using Apple Commander to put the newly assembled binaries onto a disk image and then pushing that over the wire or making it available over the wire using ADT Pro. But yeah, putting the files directly onto the disk image saved just a ton of time. Apple Commander's multi-platform. CiderPress is just Windows, right?
Yeah, it like Mike says, it'll run under Wine or Parallels or something like that as well if someone is so inclined.
We're stacking up the emulators.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
All right. Well, John Romero has made his presence known in the Apple II Facebook group. Always nice to see him in there. He's such a luminary for our community. And he posted quite a remarkable story about Bob Bishop's Apple II stuff. So, of course, Bob Bishop passed away recently. We had a little bit of a tribute to him here on Open Apple. And he left behind quite an amazing collection. And John Romero and his wife managed to rescue it. And they posted some awesome photos on Facebook. Did you guys look at these?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, the one that's really, I guess, caught everybody's eye was the not a Bell & Howell black Apple II Plus. Apparently, it was some sort of prototype for the Bell & Howell. We're not sure, but it's a neat thing. It's a black Apple II Plus that does not say Bell & Howell on it. And I believe it did not have the, what do they call that thing on the back, the caddy or the
little backpack.
Yeah, the backpack did not have that on it. And it had some hand wiring inside it. It had a terminal strip inside it with a bunch of hand wires in there. So, yeah, appears to have been some sort of prototype possibly for that Bell & Howell unit. Neat stuff. Luckily, it was rescued. They called in the right folks who knew what to do and knew what they were looking at.
So one of Bob's friends, close friends up in Paradise, California, where Bob lived, I guess was aware that the family was, the family had asked him to come by because they were going to clean out his place before they sold it, and asked him to deal with the computer stuff because they didn't know what to do with it. And he immediately called John. John got his wife and a bunch of friends, and they all went up there and rescued all of that. So it's not like they just kind of, we'll just wait until they throw everything in the dumpster and leave, and then we'll grab it. It wasn't anything like that. Well, because there were some people wondering about, did you just steal the stuff? So no, that did not happen. I know John was talking about donating kind of a large portion of it maybe to the Computer History Museum or another place where other enthusiasts could see and enjoy it. Of course, the really cool stuff that'll be in his collection. Darn it! But that's okay. It's really awesome that he went up there and did that, because Bob does have quite a legacy with the early days of Apple.
For sure, and it's a great outcome to see the stuff go into the hands of people that will appreciate it, as opposed to some auction house, or even worse, just some cleaning service that comes in when the house is empty or whatever and just throws the stuff away. That's sort of everyone's worst nightmare. Some gem hiding in someone's house somewhere, and then the person who owns it passes on, and nobody who knows how amazing it is there to pick it up. So,
well, I know that in fact recently Michael Mahone, who we had mentioned earlier, he kind of realized that he probably there were more things in his collection sitting there that would never get done than he would ever have time to get to, and he contacted Sean Fahey, and he and I think Tony Diaz and some other people went up there, and a lot of that actually ended up at the KansasFest giveaway last year, and I think there's going to be more this year. So it does bring up an interesting point. I know that the guys on the RCR stole our idea for talking about this before we talked about it. Jerks. But it sort of does bring up, the thought that, well, as Apple collectors get older, what happens when they shuffle off this mortal coil and their collection is sitting there and their wife doesn't know what that stuff is? I think, unfortunately, a lot of it just gets thrown away and lost to the mists of time, so to speak, which is really unfortunate. And it kind of makes me wonder. I look around my loft up here, and I've got all kinds of stuff, and I know my wife knows that it's important to me and to my friends, but if she had to go through this, I don't know that she would know what to do with it. So it gets me thinking about I don't know if I should update a section of my will to talk about just call these people and they'll come take away all the Apple II stuff, or what the deal is.
Yeah, it's a tough thing, because especially since a lot of collectibles, you have to be an expert to know what the really valuable stuff is compared to the junk. If we're being honest, most Apple II stuff just isn't worth anything. Yet another Platinum 2E is just really not worth anything. But that one particular Apple II that has the second sight VGA card in it is worth quite a bit, or that sealed Infocom copy of something or whatever, or the original Calibeth in a baggie. There's certain items that are just going to be worth a lot of money that someone who isn't as deep in the community as we are would know about. And that's the stuff that we worry about getting lost, I think.
And in fact, this past, it's been a year and a half, 2 years now, I was contacted by a woman whose collector hobbyist husband had died, and she had a basement full of stuff. And she contacted me or contacted the show actually, and because she didn't know what to do with it. And so I was able to kind of help her catalog some of that stuff. And she had somebody locally that was willing to go through it with her. But that can be a monumental job for somebody who doesn't know what it is and might be dealing with the grief of having lost somebody but wants it out of their house. What do you do? I could see where somebody would just say, screw it, I'm going to just call the junk guys, come take this away so I don't have to look at it again.
For sure, yeah. Well, speaking of saving history, let's talk about everyone's favorite archivist, Jason Scott.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I'm sure that he tweeted about this or Facebooked or something a while back, but I didn't notice it. Over on Jason's Flickr page, he has a collection of photos from various early computer shows, like the West Coast Computer Fair #8, and a few others. And that one took place in '83. And I think Jason is maybe my age, so like early 40s, maybe a little bit older, probably a little bit young to have taken these pictures himself. But nonetheless, there is a vast collection of photos, and they're pictures of booths of like Broderbund software and Central Point software, companies that we know and love. And you can easily find pictures of Woz and Jobs with the Apple I at PC76 or the Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair. But beyond that, if you really want to kind of just get a feel of what one of these shows was like and you're not an Apple-centric person, something like this collection really gives you a feel of what it was like to be there at the time.
For sure. I absolutely adore these photos. As part of my career, I've spent a lot of time at E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, and it's, the modern version of this. And you see there's lots of big flashy booths with all the latest, Xbox and PlayStation games and so on. And it's amazing to see Apple II stuff in that same context, to see the Broderbund booth with all of the Apple II games laid out in the same trade show kind of format. And it's just fantastic. I never would have, been able to go to such places at the time. So it's fantastic to see what they actually looked like. So speaking of archiving things, Mark, you said you've got a bunch of floppy disks of unknown or dubious origin lying around. Do you have plans to archive that stuff or image it? Jason Scott talks a lot about how important it is to capture that stuff, especially if you have programming projects or old school floppy disks, things like that, because, we have all the copies of LoadRunner that the world needs. But if you've got personal stuff, that's really where some of the real history is.
So it would be interesting for me to go back because I know that in that pile is the first floppies that I owned, so probably 1980. I'm sure they're perfectly good. The first floppies that I owned, and look back at what Mark Kriegsman was programming like back then. I've written a lot of code subsequent. And it'd be interesting just to track a personal trajectory through it all. Most of the disks that I have down there are my own code, are not commercial software, except for, I think, my development tools. So the SD macro assembler was my tool chain of choice, and I've got a couple different versions of that. That's well archived online already, though. So it really would be a personal project for me.
That would be excellent.
I'm not sure what I have in there that would be worth sharing with the world, but certainly interesting to take a look at.
Well, like I was saying, Jason Scott talks about this a lot, that it's all valuable. It's all worth saving, even if it seems oddly personal to us now. In 100 years or something, people are going to look back, and that's the stuff that's actually going to matter, because that's the stuff that tells the stories. When archaeologists are digging up pieces of clay pots, what's interesting is when you find those little bits of something really personal, someone's initials carved on the pot or something that anchors that thing in time and space, and tells a story of how someone used the thing, how someone lived with the thing, as opposed to finding a store that had a bunch of pots for sale in it. That's not very interesting. It doesn't tell a story. And I think we'll find in far into the future, everybody's junior high school programming projects are going to be actually where a lot of the value is.
Well, it's certainly on my, as you said, the list of projects that I won't get to right now, but that could change. But I'd be curious to go and dig up code that I wrote when I was about the same age that my daughter is now, and she's doing Scratch in school and things like this. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to see that there's actually a lot that's the same there, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, speaking of junior high programming projects, Calibeth is in the news again. Everybody's favorite proto-CRPG. Touch Arcade is a popular iPhone game review and discussion site, and they do this thing where every so often they dig up an iPhone game from the archives and sort of re-examine it. And one of the earlier iPhone RPG games was a port of a Calibeth from the Apple II. And so this is a bit meta because it's a retrospective on a port of a very old game to a modern platform that isn't so modern anymore. This is one of the sort of early iPhone games when the iPhone SDK first became available. It's worth talking about just because, well, of course, it's a Calibeth, but it's also neat because of the way it's been implemented, I think is worth looking at. We'll, of course, have a link in the show notes. The interfaces to these old games are often difficult to replicate when porting them to modern devices because, of course, we don't have the same keyboards and the same joysticks and so on. And so the games often play weird in an emulator. I think we've all had the experience of downloading a port of something to their iPhone or whatever, and you try to play it with some sort of weird touchscreen controls, and it just doesn't feel right. So what they've done here is they've replaced the keyboard of the Apple II with sort of things that look like keys. They're buttons, and they look like Apple II keys, but they have specific commands on them. So instead of having an A and a C key on the keyboard for attack and climb, there's actually just keys labeled attack and climb. So they've kind of distilled the keyboard of the Apple II down to whatever would be the minimum required to play a Calibeth. And they're context sensitive, which is especially clever. So as you move through the dungeon, the available keys at the bottom change. And that allows the keys themselves to be physically large on the screen so that you don't have to touch tiny keyboard keys, which is, of course, the other problem. One of my favorite things to play with on the iPhone is the C64 emulator. It's got lots of great C64 games on it, but it has this tiny keyboard that you kind of have to deal with because it shows the entire C64 keyboard on the screen. So this is a great solution. So thought I would mention it since it came across my RSS on Touch Arcade. All right, Mike, what's next on the list here?
Well, actually, it looks like one of your entries, this retro Stack Overflow. What is that?
Yeah, this is a cool thing that I hope becomes a real thing as opposed to a proposed thing. So there's been a thread going around on some of the forums, and it showed up on the Facebook page. Someone is created an initiative to try and set up kind of a retro Stack Overflow. So anyone who's a software engineer working in the cubicle world today knows Stack Overflow, of course, and hobbyists as well. If you have any sort of coding question or problem with a piece of development software or anything like that, if you Google the problem, you're almost certainly going to end up on Stack Overflow, where there's other people discussing the problem, and there's sample code and all sorts of things. It's a great resource. What's, I think, really unique about it is that the structure of it, it's part of the sort of Stack Exchange family of discussion and repository websites where questions are kind of codified. So there's only one copy of every possible question that can ever be asked. So you don't have this problem of where you have on forums where every 6 months someone asks the same question again, and there's no sort of organization to the information. So Stack Overflow has this system where questions are not allowed to be duplicated. And so if you have a question, you will find the instance of it on the site, and there will be a discussion under it with all of the known solutions to this problem. And people rank the solutions, they up and down vote them, so you're likely to get kind of the best answer. And if it's controversial, you'll get a good discussion. So it's really a fantastic way to do things. So someone is trying to set this up for retro computing programming. And the way Stack Overflow or the Stack Exchange family of sites works is if you want to create a new one, you have to create a sort of a dummy version of what it would look like with a whole bunch of sample questions, and you have to get a whole bunch of people to sign in and basically upvote the questions. So it's kind of like a petition. You have to get enough people to say, yes, this is something I want, in order to have it become a thing. So what I love about this is that we actually talked about this at KFest last year. We had kind of a side group do a 2GS programming talk. And one of the things we talked about is how to centralize the information that's out there for programming the 2GS. There's a lot of it. It's a complex machine with a lot of kind of secret knowledge. And we wanted some kind of resource for gathering all this stuff together and sharing it and organizing it. And we tossed around ideas about maybe using CSA2 or maybe using a wiki or maybe using Wikipedia. So when this retro Stack Overflow idea came along, it was like a light switch. Of course, this is the perfect way to do this because Stack Overflow is designed for exactly this kind of organization and conversation. So we'll have a link to this in the show notes. If anyone who's the least bit interested, even if you're not, honestly, please go over there and upvote some stuff so that we can hopefully make this happen, because I think it would be a really terrific resource.
So I've heard of this, the retro Stack Overflow thing before, I think, but I'm not a programmer, so I'm not sure what they're actually looking at there. Is this just a place where people can share ideas, or is it something else?
Yeah, my impression is that what they're going for is something that would be usable by not just programmers, but just anybody into retro computing. So the way it works is, people set up sample questions that they would want to ask and answer on the new Stack Overflow section. And so some of the sample questions were things like, I want to move some, floppy disks to disk images on my Atari, or whatever. How do I do that? So it looks like it's not just for programming.
Okay. And I could see where that would be an advantage over, say, something like Facebook, where, stuff bubbles to the top as it's interesting and then quickly gets buried. But how is this better than, KansasFest Apple II as a news group?
Yeah, it's the whole Stack Exchange family of sites, including Stack Overflow. It's kind of a hard thing to explain, but it really works well as a repository of knowledge because it's, the way that they categorize questions and make sure that they're unique and so on, and the way that things are archived and the way that the answers are rated. So it sort of forms, it's more of a long-term repository of knowledge rather than a discussion platform, if that makes sense.
Okay. I sort of see it. Yeah, a little bit.
I'm pretty excited about it anyway. I hope it goes through.
I find the Stack Overflow and Friends to essentially be like a living FAQ where, people say, here's my question, and then experts will jump in and answer it. But then that becomes part of the knowledge base. That question often doesn't get asked again, or if somebody asks, they'll just be referred to the first entry.
Yeah, that's actually a living FAQ is a really good way to explain it. All right, well, shall we move on, Mike? I think this next item is yours.
It is, and I'm not sure how I feel about actually talking about it because the book is the Home Computer Wars. It's Mike Tomczyk, who worked at, I think, Commodore and Atari back when those companies mattered and they were competing with Apple and the other home computers. It's been out of print forever, and the used copies on Amazon sell for like $80 or $100 or something ridiculous. And like that, the author has said that, I'm gonna come up with a new edition of this, so don't pirate my book. But there's a PDF out there, and it's been a long time, I think, since he's actually made that promise, and there's been no forward motion on it. So I'd say in the meantime, we'll have the link in the show notes, of course, but there is a PDF that you can grab, and I highly suggest reading it because it's an excellent book. And if he ever comes out with the new edition, then go and buy that.
Cool. That might be a good read.
Next up, we have fonts. Macworld.com has a neat article on Apple's retro fonts, is what he's calling them, and he goes through a history of the Garamond and things like that. But he also actually goes back to the modern Tectura and the design decisions and how that sort of works into the overall appeal of the design of the product. It's a fun article. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought this was a really good read. I'm a bit of a type nerd. One of my favorite documentaries is the one called Helvetica. And, I think people underestimate the importance of type and how it influences the way you perceive products and signage and so on. And that is definitely, it's one of those things that Apple has just always, from the very beginning, really gotten right. And there's just something classy and high tech about the typefaces that they always choose, and they always, they update them carefully with the times and so on to keep them, pardon the pun, to keep them looking fresh and modern. And I'm a big fan of Apple's fonts.
Yeah, and I think this goes way back to that. There's the well-known story of Jobs going up to Reed College and taking the calligraphy classes and really learning how important fonts are, and spacing and size and choice, the choice of the font that you use in the situation. It really comes through, and I like the article's written by Christopher Finn, Phin, and it's a quick article, but it's informative and it's a good read.
So moving along, let's see. We talk a lot about Halt and Catch Fire on the show. In fact, for a while there, we practically had a Halt and Catch Fire segment. So for anyone who's been listening to our recent episodes, if you didn't have any idea what we're talking about because you didn't watch the show, well, now's your chance. The entire first season of Halt and Catch Fire is now available for watching online legally online at amc.com's website. So we will definitely link to that in the show notes. And, it's definitely worth watching. I think, as we've said before, it's not brilliant television or anything, but it's fun for us 80s nerds who want to geek out on the nostalgia, and pretty non-threatening watch for that reason. Mark, have you been watching *Halt and Catch Fire* at all?
I have not been keeping up with that, but certainly it gets kicked around the office every now and then. Engineers of a certain age are quite taken with it. I think it might be right in my sweet spot, so now I'm going to go take a look.
It got really surreal there at the end of the first season, but there is going to be a second season. They have confirmed that, and they interviewed one of the producers of the show, said that they're aware that fans were kind of unhappy about the way things went, and they're going to try and get back to the basics. So I'm looking forward to that.
Cool. So actually, that was going to be my next question, is if anyone knew if there was actually going to be a season 2, because I haven't honestly seen anything about it. Season 1 kind of ended quietly, and then there wasn't much about it. So it's interesting to see that it's coming back. I think criticisms that we've had of it probably are still true, that always felt like they tried a little too hard to, ramp up the drama. There was a lot of kind of shock and awe kind of writing in it, trying to... I imagine there's a lot of pressure on television writers these days to be increasingly edgy and forward-thinking, with TV shows getting so graphic and edgy these days. There did seem to be a lot of that going on that felt a little bit forced, and the actual story and the setting kind of got lost in the heavy-handed drama in a few places, I thought. All right. So with this month's *Halt and Catch Fire* segment out of the way, let's move on to more interesting hardware kinds of things. Have either of you heard of this thing called the SD Disc 2?
Yes, and in fact, I just got mine in the mail the other day.
Did you really? So you've ordered one of these things?
Well, I've ordered the emulator. I have not ordered the item that we're about to talk about.
Okay, cool. This is a solid state storage solution for Apple II, like the SD Floppy 2 or the Uni S-Disc or the CFFA that all of us know and love, but it's one that I haven't really seen a lot of press for. So where did you hear about this thing? I mean, until I saw this article, I actually had never heard of this device.
It doesn't have as many neat features as the Unis disc. Is that how it's pronounced? The one that's made by Nishida Radio. But I don't know if Nishida Radio is even selling those anymore, and these you can get on eBay right now. And he announced that recently that he's now making a little LCD for it. It's a plug-in board that you can attach to the internals, I guess, and it'll give you a kind of a readout of what disk image you're working with. And so it looks interesting.
So there's the SD Floppy 2, which is the Bulgarian fellow who sells them on eBay, and they look kind of like they're a small form factor, and they're made in inside like an aluminum extrusion, which is very nice looking actually. And then Charles Mangan actually makes, as my understanding is, he makes or is planning to make a 3D printed enclosure for it that makes it look like a Disc 2, but straight out of the box, the Bulgarian one does not. So this thing that we found this link for, this is something else. This is from Korea, and it's called the SD Disc 2. And it's another solution that I have never seen before, but it came across my feed because the creator of it has added an LCD screen to it. Again, going back to the SD Floppy 2, that, as you say, the fellow who makes that is also making a display for that, or he showed a display for that on the Facebook group that was similar to those old mods you could do to Disk 2 drives that would show which track they're accessing. I forget what that thing was called, the Tracker or something like that.
Trackstar.
Yeah, there you go. So he had done that to his device, which was kind of neat. But this is, again, something entirely different. So this is something, like I say, something out of Korea. The website is mostly in Korean, so I'm not sure exactly what I'm looking at, other than there's pictures of this thing that are pretty neat looking, and it is some other type of solid-state device for Apple IIs. And if anyone knows anything more about this, by all means, let us know. I don't see a place to obviously order one, but it does look like a product. Here you go. He says at the bottom, fellow's name is Ian Kim, and he says you can purchase it soon on eBay. So it may be for sale now, honestly. I don't know. He's got kind of a blog here where he's sort of laying out his development of it, I guess. This one looks quite nice, too. The little display is really quite cool looking. So we'll definitely keep our eye on that. How about you, Mark? Do you have any experience with solid-state devices on Apple IIs?
I have not done the solid state on an Apple II. I had for a while a 20th anniversary Macintosh, which had a 2.5-inch IDE drive in there, which was very slow, and replaced that with a flash card, and was very happy with that. One of the things I found was amazing when I started looking at these solid state devices for the Apple II, though, is the largest ProDOS volume you can put together is 32 megabytes, and that's like, you can't get SD cards that small anymore. Everything is a 1 gig card or a half gig card. We've moved up several stages in the unit tree here.
Yeah, it is pretty funny. The smallest SD card you can probably buy at Walgreens will store the entire catalog of Apple II software ever made without breaking a sweat.
Right. It's like, I have some Apple II discs on here. Oh, yes? Which ones? All of them.
Yeah. It's a keychain. I have all the Apple II software. Yeah. I mean, of course, we would have killed for even a 32 megabyte partition or hard drive back at the time. So it is pretty amazing how we just throw away gigabytes of storage now as tchotchkes at trade shows.
Yeah, I've got a 5 megabyte profile drive down in the basement. It was the Apple branded drive that they mostly sold for the Apple III, I guess.
Yep.
But it was a 5 megabyte drive, took 20 minutes to warm up, literally. But it's, much, much faster than the floppy, but, thousands of dollars in its day for those 5 megabytes.
My very first hard drive was for my 2GS, actually, and it was a 40 megabyte SCSI drive. And it had a few quirks, like I had to power it up before the machine. It took a few seconds to spin up and various other things. And it was enormous because it had this big case and power supply and so on. Yeah, it was just fantastic. It was just an amazing thing at the time. Of course, when I first got it, it was just so much space. I thought I would never fill it. And before too long, like all hard drives, even today, it's never big enough. But I did definitely enjoy the heck out of that thing. It made the 2GS into almost a modern machine. I ran the kind of the combination. There's this combination environment you can build with the GNU sort of Unix-like system and the Orca tools, Orca C and Orca M and Orca Shell. You can kind of put together this Unix-like system that boots into that instead of messing around with GSOS, which is very slow. Yeah, that's primarily how I used my 2GS for many years. So, but speaking of solid-state storage, my personal favorite in this space is I'm pronouncing it Uni S-Disk, just because I think it's supposed to be, because it was originally the S-Disk, because it was SD, because it's SD card, but then it also acts like a Unidisc, because it emulates SmartPort, so... Yeah,
I'm sticking with Unisdisk anyway.
Yeah, Unisdisk does have a certain ring to it. I think I've gone back and forth, honestly. I'm sure people have heard me say Unisdisk on this show, but this week I'm saying Uni S-Disk. So I recently got my own Uni S-Disk up and running on my 2C+. In fact, I'll be talking a little bit more about that later in the show in the tech segment. But the reason I want to mention it here is because there is a firmware update for it. So any users out there who have one, you should go on to Nishida Radio's site, and we will have a link to that, of course, where you can update your firmware. The great thing about this device is it's super easy to do. You just download this file from his site, and you put it on the SD card, and you put it in the machine, and you hold down a button while you turn it on, and it just updates its own firmware. So it's super easy. Oh, and the other great thing about this firmware update is it includes source code. So if anyone has, dreams of writing their own solid-state storage type device for the Apple II, he's giving away his source code for how he does it, which is really quite wonderful, especially the SmartPort support. SmartPort is not the easiest thing in the world to emulate, and I think that's the reason that nobody else is doing it. Well, I suppose I don't know exactly how the CFFA works. Maybe it does that. But most of the other solid-state options anyway only do Disk 2 support because it's quite a bit easier to do. So, if anyone else out there who has one of these solutions of their own that they're developing, you should grab his source code and see how he does the SmartPort, because it's very cool.
I think the CFFA is kind of the premier one, the card that everybody wants. The runs always sell out immediately, but like you said, the Unisdisk can be made to work with a 2C, whereas the CFFA card takes up its own slot, so that's automatically the 2C's out.
Yes, us 2C users have longingly looked at the CFFA for many years. I've actually thought about trying to graft one internally into the 2C because there is an expansion bus of sorts in there. It was, originally intended for the memory expansion. And on the 2C Plus, there's an auxiliary connector next to the memory expansion port, because the memory expansion port is not a full Apple II slot. But the 2C Plus has this auxiliary connector right next to it that they added that includes a bunch of the signals that are missing from that original port that are included in a normal Apple II slot. So
that's interesting.
What I'm wondering is it might actually be possible to, I haven't actually gone in there and looked to see if all the signals are necessary that the CFFA needs, if they're all there. But if they are, it should theoretically be possible to graft a CFFA internally into a 2C Plus, that is. Now, of course, whether it would physically fit is an entirely separate question. I suspect it wouldn't. It's awfully tight in there. And the CFFA is a pretty beefy card. One of these days, I might just give that a try. It would be obviously some surgery to adapt the connectors and so on, but it would be very cool to see if it's at least possible.
Did you hear that, folks? Quinn will be selling the CFFA card adapted to 2C at KansasFest this year.
Yeah, and the only catch is that you have to take the top off your 2C and it sticks up out of the case.
So now what we're waiting for is the same way people made like MP3 players in the shape and form factor of a cassette that you could actually pop into a cassette player. Now we need the SD card drive that's in the form factor of a 3.5-inch floppy that you can just pop into that 2C Plus slot.
Well, it's funny you should mention that. Actually, there was such a device for a while. And now that I've said it, of course, I'm going to have to try and find the link. So I've set myself up for some Googling. But when I was originally looking into solid state options, that was one of the things I wondered is, hey, has anyone done that? Because, of course, we all remember when CD players first came along, there were these wacky adapters you could get that were like a dummy cassette that had a sort of a playhead inside it that was connected to a phono plug that you could stick into your car stereo and thus drive your CD player through your car stereo's cassette player. They were terrible, of course, but it was a way to do it if you had no other way. And I often wondered, is there something similar for SD cards? And in fact, there was. There was a 3.5-inch floppy disk that had an SD card, like a dummy disk that had 3.5-inch, or it had an SD card slot on the outside of it. And it was probably PC only. I don't imagine why anyone would make something like that for any market other than that. I found it on a website, and it was no longer for sale, but, it was a for sale storefront type of thing, but it was out of stock, and it didn't appear as though there was ever going to be stock again. It was one of those sites where you could tell there was a sort of dust on it. But it was, a neat-looking device. I don't know how exactly it worked, presumably the same way. I guess there was some sort of fake kind of playhead that would make the floppy drive think it was reading from a floppy disk. But I'll try and dig up the link for that because it's an interesting photo. It looks just like you would think. It looks like a 3.5-inch floppy disk with a SD card slot in the edge of it. So I don't know whatever happened to that thing or if it would have ever worked on an Apple II, but it would be neat to track one down and try it. So speaking of Apple IICs and our lack of SD storage options, I understand that John Carmack still has a 2C, Mike.
I don't know if this was his first Apple II or not. Carmack and John Romero, I think, both got their Apple II programming start. Really, their careers kind of took off when they got hired at SoftDisk, and they worked there for a while. And I know that John at least still has his Apple IIc, and his kids have reached that age where they're becoming cognizant of the world around them, and they're becoming interested. And so he's sat at least one of them down, I think both of them, at his Apple IIc, and is showing them how to program in AppleSoft Basic.
Yeah, he's got a funny quote there, something about teaching your kids. I guess it was a tweet. Teaching your kids to program on an Apple II is like ninja training them in the forest or something. I don't know. It was sort of a pithy kind of nerd sounding quote, but I thought it was
Kung Fu training in the primitive wilderness.
There you go. Which I thought was a little bit overstating it. I mean, honestly, I kind of feel like it's the opposite. I think that these 80s computers were more approachable from a programming standpoint than modern computers are. You could literally every single one of them, you could turn it on and it would put you at a prompt where you could type 10 print hello, 20 go to 10. And, you could be doing that in seconds. And every modern computer, of course, there's just gigabytes of code that have to load before you can even attempt to write any kind of code. And of course, there's all manner of crazy documentation and so on required. You have to pick from various specifically designed kid-friendly languages like Scratch or, the Lego language or various other things. So it's, you have to know where to go and you have to download and install things. And it's this whole big process to try and get your kids programming on a modern computer. But an Apple II, it's hard not to program it because you turn it on and it just presents you with an AppleSoft prompt, which is the easiest form of programming, I think, that has ever existed.
Cult of Mac ran a little article on it, and in fact, he says that this was not his original Apple II equipment. My wife got me a bunch of retro hardware for Christmas a few years ago, and that's what this Apple IIc was. He got started on an Apple II at school, and then later bought himself a 2GS.
Nice to know he was a 2GS person like myself.
Yeah, there's a few of you out there, I guess.
We've heard from
16-bit weirdos.
Yes, well, we've heard from some listeners that there isn't enough 2GS love on the show. So I'm going to personally rectify that because I got lots of 2GS love in my heart. I just got to get it.
No, I will fight tooth and nail or something.
Yeah, you won't be happy until this is an Apple III show.
Well, that's true. Actually, I have one of those.
Are we going to have a segment discussing the fill mode in the graphics too?
So, let's get back to 8-bit stuff. And in fact, early on in the 8-bit, there was this wacky thing called VisiCalc. Have you heard of it, Mike?
I think so. Yeah, it's one of those program number things that, counts and adds and stuff.
I'm an avid podcast listener, obviously, since here we are making them. And one of my favorite podcasts is Planet Money, one of the suite of NPR podcasts, quite excellent. But imagine my surprise when it showed up in my feed with a screenshot of VisiCalc. So this is making the rounds in the retro community, but I wanted to mention it here since it is an Apple II thing, and we are the Apple II podcast of record. They did a history of spreadsheets, because they're a show about finance, and spreadsheets are intimately linked with that. They talked all about spreadsheets and the origins thereof. So, of course, VisiCalc was the bulk of the show. So we'll link to that. It's definitely an entertaining listen. One of the most interesting things that I learned about it was that spreadsheets I think they were more significant, I guess, than I realized, or a lot of us realized maybe who aren't accountants, that it kind of eliminated a whole category of accounting. Like it basically eliminated bookkeeping as a profession, more or less. So, there used to be these armies of bookkeepers who, when a business wanted to run an experiment, what would happen if we changed our paper supplier from this company to that company? How would that affect, our bottom line and our taxes and everything else? And, these armies of bookkeepers would go off and spend an entire day or even 3 or 4 days running all these numbers and working all that out, and then would come back to you with the answer. So obviously the spreadsheet would do that in, 3 or 4 seconds. And that was quite a big deal at the time. So it made that portion of the field of accounting so much more efficient that basically then all the people who just used to do bookkeeping sort of became more accountants. And it kind of elevated the whole profession in a sense by eliminating all that busy work. It just sort of allowed everybody to focus more on the kind of the high level aspects of accounting and business management. So anyway, that was all a little dry, but I thought it was interesting. If you didn't think spreadsheets could be interesting, I would suggest you listen to this show.
And VisiCalc in particular was kind of the program that helped the Apple II take off, and sales people saw this and for the first time realized that this wasn't just a hobbyist game machine, and sales really kind of rose exponentially when VisiCalc went on sale. And if you're interested after listening to the podcast, Dan Bricklin over at Bricklin.com has a whole history of his company Software Arts and their distributor personal software, which later became VisiCorp, and the program itself, VisiCalc. So you can really, really dive deep with that stuff.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's see. Let's move on to, we talked a little bit about the CFFA, and one of the other interesting exotic interface cards that is out there is the Carte Blanche 2. And this is something we've talked about before when they reopened orders for it. The Carte Blanche, the original Carte Blanche was an FPGA development board, essentially, that you could stick in your Apple II. And the Carte Blanche 2 was announced a while back, and he started taking orders for that. And the reservations are now closed for production run number 1 of that device. So that's actually encouraging news. I guess if he closed the production run, that means that a lot of people ordered them. So really excited to see what people can do with an FPGA in their Apple II.
It's bad news if you were hoping to get on the list and you didn't, but it's definitely good news because there's interest. I know when the first round of cards came out, I think there was some misunderstanding about what the card was and what you could do with it. This is definitely a developer board. It'll sit in your Apple II nicely and won't really do much until you make it do whatever it is that you want to do. But you'll need to have some hardware skills and some time to play with that.
Yeah, this device, it's the kind of thing where if you're a hardware hacker, if you're not a hardware hacker, it makes utterly no sense whatsoever. If you are a hardware hacker, it's exactly what you always wanted, and it's amazing. So there's quite a gap there, I think. How about you, Mark? Have you ever played with FPGAs?
FPGA is coming up next on my horizon. My partner in crime on the FastLED project has started dipping his toes in there, and he's quite enthusiastic about it. So, we're excited about the idea of purpose-built hardware that can do color space transforms in a single clock cycle and things like that.
Very cool.
Not yet.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. I've played a lot with microcontrollers and that kind of stuff, and FPGAs are kind of the next frontier for me as well. And I definitely keep intending to dip my feet into that particular pool, although I did miss out on the carte blanche too, but maybe next run. All right, so moving right along here. This is a nice little demo that came along from Dagan Brock, actually, for the 2GS. There's the missing 2GS love that we've been asked for. This is actually... Wow, don't sound so excited. You don't seem very sincere, Mike. I don't know.
I am. I like the 2GS, I guess.
Go ahead and qualify it. I let you have your woos segment, so you're going to let me talk about the 2GS.
Yeah, all right.
So this is a little demo that Dagan Brock put together, who I think he's doing more with the 2GS. Him and Brutal Deluxe are probably doing more with the 2GS right now than anybody else in the community, which is awesome. I like to see that. And he did this actually before the holidays, he calls it a 2GS micro demo. And it's called Snow, and it's a very tasteful sort of black and white image of a tree being snowed on, and there's snow falling. And it's very nice, and I bring it up now just because it came across my YouTube feed again recently, and I realized I don't think we had talked about it, and it was really nice and deserves to be mentioned on the show. It reminds me a lot of the main menu from the FTA Christmas demo. It had the word Xmas in big letters, and there was menu options above it for the various sections of the demo. And there was snow falling, and the snow would kind of pile up on the letters. And it was super, super well done. And of course, like I'm sure many of us did, I did in fact leave it running for hours once just to see if it would literally fill the screen with snow. And it does. So if you're ever really, really bored, fire up an emulator or your real hardware and load up that FTA Xmas demo and just let it run on that main menu. It's pretty funny to watch it fill the whole screen with snow. It does take a while. It fills it up. Not every pixel sticks. Each little snowflake. Some of them, about maybe half or a third of them actually stick. So you have to let it run for quite a long time to pile it up. But yeah, it does do it. It's very neat.
So what's this Apple II display thing that I'm seeing on my spreadsheet?
Well, a little while ago, I went to Stanford to give a guest lecture to one of their electrical engineering classes and also their women in computer science group. And I was talking about Veronica, the homemade computer that I showed last year at KansasFest. And, I've been, as I'm sure most of our listeners probably know by now, I've been blogging about it and so on. And the folks at Stanford saw that and wanted me to come and give a chat to their students about it. And that was a lot of fun. And what was especially neat was on the third floor of the ironically named Bill Gates Computer Science Building, there is a display case with a whole range of vintage Apple II hardware in it. And so that was quite a nice surprise to come around the corner and see that just in one of their kind of common areas. And so it's, I was super happy to see it there and really glad they're recognizing the history there. The sort of funny thing about it, though, now I took a picture of this, which I'll share in the show notes. The funny thing about it is that they were really quite sad specimens of Apple II hardware. There was an Apple II, there was an Apple IIc, and it was missing a key, and there was a 2E, I think it was, and it was all dirty and like all yellowed, and there was pieces missing, and what was funny is that they could go on eBay right now and buy far better looking examples for $20. So it's a bit of a mystery why they have these really sad broken old Apple IIs in their display case as this sort of historical archive of hardware. It's kind of a theme in the building. They have these display cases everywhere that have samples of historical hardware, and there's some really amazing stuff, prototypes from the 60s and stuff. Lots of really rare and interesting things. But yeah, my guess is that some professor probably had this in their office and they needed to fill a display case. So they said, oh, here, just take this stuff or something. Because, if someone had set out to do an Apple II display, I feel like they could have done a lot better than this just by putting Apple II into an eBay search. But who knows what the story is there.
Now, this is clearly the most important piece of hardware in the building because it actually has Bill Gates' code in it, right?
That's right.
Oh, yeah, good point.
in the Applesoft Baker, right?
Maybe it was just students donating their parents' old Apple IIs or something.
Yeah, it could
there was
be.
Just a pile of them there.
Yeah, it could be. I had sort of a tour guide of sorts while I was there, and I asked him if he knew where these came from and what the story was, but of course he didn't know. They have undoubtedly some sort of committee or something at the university that does this sort of stuff for them, but who knows how it got there. But it was a bit sad.
I know that when Steve Jobs returned to Apple in '97, the first thing he did was donate a huge amount of their archives and equipment and things like that to Stanford. So maybe this is just pieces of that.
Yeah, it could be. Well, if anyone at Stanford, I guess, administration or whoever does these sorts of things is listening, get in touch with us. We can help you set up a much nicer Apple II display for almost no money. Honestly, there's nicer stuff at the garage giveaway at KansasFest. So send a representative to KansasFest and we'll hook you up with a very nice Apple II display. How about that?
Next up is a news item from A2 Central. It seems that Mouser is now stocking the Western Design Center's 65XX dev boards that we've talked about. The cheap ones for $89 or $99, and there's a more expensive kit for $189 or $199, depending on the options that you get.
Cool. Yeah, I think it was last month or the month before we did talk about this, that they were now showing up on Mouser, but at the time they were not showing any stock available. So it's cool that they now have stock. So I guess you can actually click a button now and one will appear in your house. So Mike, what's this thing called the Classic IDE? Talk to me about that.
There's a lot of people involved on Facebook with the Apple II enthusiasts group, and someone posted, it was just a picture of coming soon, the Classic IDE Mark II. Really no details on that, but the board is made by a company, or may just be a guy, called Technobytes, and if you go to their website, I couldn't find any reference to the Mark II, but you can read about the old one that's currently sold out, and I think this is sort of like the board that Reactive Micro used to sell, the MicroDrive and the MicroDrive Turbo. It's an IDE interface to your Apple II, so that's coming soon.
Cool, yeah, and of course, probably the best part of an IDE interface is that you can get trivial adapters that will adapt that to a compact flash. So this is yet another way to get solid state storage for your Apple II if you have an expansion slot. This is kind of a nice option since the CFFA is currently unobtainium. So if people are looking for that, this could be another option.
And it's always good just to have more hardware being produced for the Apple II.
Well, speaking of hardware and, in fact, solid-state storage, we were talking about the Bulgarian fellow who does the SD Floppy 2. I'm not going to attempt his name because I would mangle it, but he's quite an awesome guy, and he's doing really cool stuff with hardware on the Apple II. And the newest thing is he's making some sort of sound card or a music card. Is that right?
Yeah, so he's recreated the MC1 ALF, which I think is a MIDI interface card. And the link that we have in the show notes, that particular auction has ended, but I think he's selling more of them. So if you're into the kind of MIDI interface and playing around with that, I know that this card is kind of a desirable one, and the manuals have been the manuals and the software have been hard to find, and I guess he's got a copy of that and the board itself, and it looks like this particular one sold for $51, so pretty reasonable price.
Yeah, his hardware is all really reasonably priced, actually. It's one of the best parts of his stuff. So yeah, not only is he doing interesting things that mostly that other people aren't doing, he's also selling them very reasonably priced. I'm going to say his name is Playman Vasilov. I feel like we deserve to say his name at least attempt to. So I apologize if I've said your name wrong, but we think you're awesome. All right, moving along, VCF East 10.0. This is pretty exciting. Looks like it's been announced.
Actually, 3 of them. VCF 10 has been announced for April 17th through the 19th in Wall, New Jersey. VCF Southeast has been announced May 2nd and 3rd in Roswell, Georgia. And the VCF Midwest has been announced for August 29th and 30th in Elk Grove Village, which I think is a suburb of Chicago in Illinois.
That's a lot of VCFs.
Still no sign of the original, though.
Yeah, I feel like I could pretty much just throw a rock and I would hit a VCF.
VCF East just got some attention on Slashdot, so I wouldn't be surprised if that does good things for attendance.
Yeah, I feel like the VCF events are among the few kind of retro computing events that get some amount of mainstream traction, because I've heard references to them in kind of non-retro computing circles. I can't think of any examples offhand, but if any of these events is going to kind of break out more into the mainstream, I feel like that's the one that's got the best shot. I don't expect to see CNN rolling up at KansasFest anytime soon, but that's their loss.
Well, I think these are more oriented for the casual historian or somebody who might be interested but isn't geeky about this stuff. I think they're like 2 days long, or Friday night and Saturday and part of Sunday, and they're cheap, and they're kind of set up more as a museum. Kind of come in and play and enjoy the machines for a little while and learn about the people, or learn about them from the people who set up the displays, rather than something like KansasFest where it's Apple II sessions and you're there for a week and you dive deep into that. So that makes sense that would be kind of a more mainstream thing than what we do in Kansas City.
Yeah, I think you're right. They cast a really wide net as well. They talk about all different kinds of retro computers, including all the way back to the 50s and 60s, the big iron and the vacuum tube stuff. As you say, yeah, it's very much set up as a kind of nice place to take the kids on a Saturday afternoon, and that's an easier time of attracting groups of families than you'll ever get at some sort of hardcore function like the listeners of our show would attend.
The VCF Midwest Facebook post does mention that it's going to be more expensive than last year. I guess there was some problems with a place that they were renting before, or that place decided they're just not renting to the public anymore, and they had to move. So it says the price has gone up a little bit, but it doesn't say how much. Last year was $79, so probably still pretty affordable.
Cool. Have any of you ever been to a VCF event?
Mark?
I have not been to one of these. My local pile of old hardware stomping ground, the MIT Swap Fest, which is monthly, April through October. There's a pretty good turnout there, pretty much all summer, and all kinds of hardware, going back to what kind of vacuum tube do you want here, up through video games and retro computing and all kinds of stuff. It's a good time. In general, I come away happier if I go there to sell things, because if I go there to buy things, I do, and then I have all these things. But there's quite an assortment of goodies there.
That sounds like a fun thing. Out here in my neck of the woods, we have the TRW Swap Meet, which was originally like a ham radio kind of thing, and it's been one of these things that's been running since, I don't know, the 50s or something. And I think it's every other, or once a month, or last Sunday of the month or something. Anyway, I have to look it up. I'll have a link to that in the show notes if anyone is in the Southern California area and is interested in going. It's a really fun event, but it's not so much with the retro computing. But if you're interested in really old hardware, analog oscilloscopes, and old CB and ham radio equipment, and lots of fun stuff like that, it's a fun place to go. There's also sections with cheap, kind of more modern hardware. If you need a cheap LCD for your Apple II, it's a good place to go for that kind of stuff as well.
I think the MIT Swap Fest also started as a ham radio event.
That sounds right. Yeah, I think so. Quinn, you'd mentioned an LCD.
I did, yeah. Speaking of LCDs, looks like people are starting to retrofit them into Apple monitors, which is kind of a fun idea. I guess hopefully people aren't cannibalizing working monitors to do it. I don't think there's much of that, but it is a good idea. And in this case, an intrepid Apple II enthusiast has retrofitted one into an Apple IIc monitor, which is an especially good idea because it's a good form factor for an LCD, and it's kind of nice to keep it light and portable. So it's really well executed, and what's especially neat, of course, is that it's then color, which the Apple IIc monitor was not. So it's neat to see, the conversion has been done quite convincingly. So at least, in a photo, I guess in real life, of course, you could tell that the glass isn't curved and all that. But in photos, it looks very convincing, and it's neat to see a color image on an Apple IIc monitor. So, of course, we will link to this.
I have a caveat about this, actually. As we all know, the Apple II doesn't put out exactly an NTSC signal. It's a little off. And if you get a cheap color NTSC LCD panel, like the kind of thing that normally goes in the back of a headrest of a car, they don't have the horizontal hold and vertical hold adjustments on them. And so the signal can sometimes cause the image to just keep scrolling up all the time. So definitely say if you're going to do this kind of thing, test it with a particular panel before you build the panel into the case.
Definitely, yeah.
Because some of the otherwise has a very retro look as the screen keeps scrolling up.
We talked about this. I think it was last month actually about the difficulty of sometimes finding an LCD that does work on an Apple II. Because just like you say, it's not quite NTSC. It's NTSC-ish, and there are some that work well, but there are lots that don't. So. There's a little bit of experimentation required.
Yeah, so this was done by Javier. I'm sorry, Javier, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I'm not going to try. He's active on the Apple II Enthusiasts Facebook group, and he's the one that does all the retro brighting. He's done a lot of experiments with retro bright, and Call Apple is where I found the news item, but it links to his webpage, which has a nice write-up on the specific steps and photos and everything, so we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, Javier is sort of known as the master of retrobright on the Apple II Enthusiasts Facebook group, and he is really quite good at it. He's really got the process down. He's always posting photos of his latest retrobright project, and they look just amazing.
So back in 2013, when Woz came to KansasFest, Brian Weiser took the opportunity to introduce Call Apple's WozPack Special Edition. This is a joint project that Brian did with Bill Martins, and at the time it was only available in softcover, and they've announced that you can now buy it as a hardcover if you prefer that sort of reading experience. Still no ebook, though.
Yeah, hardcovers are kind of neat. I'm more of an ebook person these days myself, but I do like hardcovers sometimes. Yeah, moving along with this. Next item catches my eye because it mentions the Laser 128, which was the computer that I had during my 2E years. We went from an Apple II Plus to a Laser 128EX in our family. So apparently the Qbert clone for the Apple II called Qbit didn't work on the Laser 128. Is that right?
According to the article, again on Call Apple, there was a memory location jump that would basically cause the game to stop midstream. They have an analysis of the section of assembly code that caused this, and it's finally been patched, so that will not happen anymore. It's a 1-byte change.
That's neat. I wish I had more time because I'd like to dig into this a little bit. I wonder if this was a bug that only existed in the original Laser 128, because as I say, we had the 128EX, and I do remember actually playing Qbit. It was a game I liked. So I suspect maybe it was something that, maybe it was like a bug or a quirk that they fixed in the EX ROMs. I'm not sure what all the differences are exactly between, there was the 128 and the 128EX and the 128EX2. And I'm sure there were probably some ROM differences between the different versions. So if there are any laser experts out there, by all means, write in and let us know the details there. The Laser 128 was the 2E for the rest of us. Virtual 2, which is the Macintosh Apple II emulator, not Virtual Apple II.
which is the web-based emulator, has been updated to version 7.5.2. And it addresses a couple of minor bugs. So if you don't have that, you should go get that.
Definitely. Anyone who does not own Virtual 2 should go run, don't walk, and buy it right now. Mark, do you have Virtual 2?
I do have Virtual 2. Virtual 2 was the emulator that I used to do the development for FastLED 6502.
Excellent.
And being able to do that, stop and dig in and debug, clearly it has a lot of features in there that are designed to help write new software for the Apple II, which is exactly what I was doing.
Yeah, for sure.
I was very happy with it.
Virtual 2 is an Apple II developer's dream. It's got everything you could possibly want to do that with.
Sweet 16 is probably the 2GS emulator of choice on the Mac platform, and Virtual 2 is definitely the 8-bit Apple choice.
All right. So, Mike, what's this next thing about vintage micro music?
Okay, so I think we talked about this one last month or the month before as well. Stinks, I think is how you pronounce his handle. It's what he goes by. Has a channel on SoundCloud, and he has gone through and extracted various music tracks from Mockingboard discs and MIDI interfaces and things like that, and put them on SoundCloud, and you can listen to them as a playlist. And he has also now opened up a YouTube channel, so you can get, I guess, like a graphic of the program as the song is playing. Now, YouTube doesn't have very good audio, but I mean, we're talking about 8-bit Apple II songs here, so I don't know how much that's really going to affect your listening experience. But if you prefer YouTube to SoundCloud, that's now available.
Yeah, I think YouTube audio quality could only make the Apple II sound better, honestly. And that's why I'm a 2GS fan.
A couple more music items here, since we're talking about Apple II music. Last summer, we talked about Joe, I still don't know if it's pronounced Eli or Ellie. He's a Southern rocker. He's collaborated with The Clash and done a lot of solo stuff on his own. Quick recap, if you didn't hear it before, in 1983, he produced an album called B484 or B484. And this was done entirely with his Apple II Plus and a MIDI card and a Roland drum machine. And he took it to his record label, and they said, "We like it, but we don't know how to sell it." So he had to go back to the studio and re-record everything with standard instruments, and it didn't sell very well. And I guess recently he was going through his archives and he found the original Apple II recordings, and so he released those as an album that you can buy. Now he's on tour in support of that album. I don't know if he's carrying around the Apple II Plus that he used, but it looks like a multi-city tour, and tickets are available now if he's in your area.
Well, we will link to that in the show notes.
Has anyone mentioned the Todd Rundgren connection? Have we covered that? Todd Rundgren, the 80s and 90s and still today rock and roller, also wrote the graphics tablet software for the Apple II.
Yeah, I think I knew that, but I don't think we've actually gone in depth into the history of that.
Yeah, I certainly actually did not know that.
Yeah, so his band was Utopia, Todd Rundgren Utopia, and the graphics tablet software for the Apple II on the Apple branded tablet was the Utopia graphics system, written by him.
Yeah, that is cool. So speaking of musicians working on Apple stuff, let's talk about Jonathan Mann. Okay,
so back in the previous era of this podcast with Ken, when he was here, we mentioned that Jonathan Mann had recorded a fun little song called "He's Just the Waz," kind of a goofy poppy song. It's fun. And he also has released now it's called the Apple Songs Mixtape, and it's about, I think, 12 or 15 Apple-related songs. And I went over to his website and was reading around, and he's actually, he's a very good musician. And I think that the difference between what makes Weird Al Yankovic popular for all these years is that in addition to being a funny wordsmith and having fun with these tunes, he's a good musician as well. The music is good, and a lot of the jokey songs that you hear are just terrible songs in general. But Jonathan Mann is not like that. And he's, I guess, been writing he says he's been doing this song a day project for like 2,000 days, which is just a huge amount of music. So I guess if you do it for that long, you would get pretty good at it. But the neat thing about it is that this is a name your price album. So if you wanted to, you could download this for free.
Yeah, I think most people probably know Jonathan Mann as the Song a Day guy. He shows up on Boing Boing and other similar outlets regularly just because of obviously the sheer volume, but it's quite cool. I heard an interview with him recently on another podcast, and he talks about his creative process of how he manages to write a song every single day and why he still does it after so many years. He's continuing to do it. It's quite a cool process that he goes through, and so obviously he needs to continually come up with new topics for songs, and so he writes a lot of songs about current events, and he's done songs about Gamergate, for example, or whatever's in the news, and he's done some retro computing ones. So it's cool to see some Apple related stuff coming out of there. He's quite a guy.
Certainly not all of it is Apple II related. Most of it's more modern era Apple, but there's a couple of gems in there for you.
Yeah, if you process it down to 1-bit speaker pops, then it's all Apple II related.
Right.
So speaking of Apple II music, which I put in scare quotes, there's an interesting new game demo that has come out. And actually, I shouldn't make fun because the music in this is actually pretty good for Apple II. So there's this new game demo that has come out called the Music Master RPG. It's kind of a fun little homebrew project. It's sort of like a graphical adventure game along the lines of like the Scott Adams adventures, but the artwork is all done in low-res graphics, which is sort of retro fun. And each scene has its own music, which is kind of the theme of the adventure as well. And it's there's a lot of quite good music in it, actually. So it's definitely worth listening to if you want to see what the Apple II is actually capable of with its sad little speaker. The author's asking for feedback on this demo on CSA2, so we will link to that thread.
Yeah, his name is Tom Porter, and it doesn't look like he has any feedback yet. I guess the gameplay maybe needs some work, but the music is great.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. So we'll link to that, and we'll send our vast audience over there to give him feedback on his game.
That's right.
Both of our listeners will flood the thread right now, I'm sure.
And okay, so last summer when we did the Lawless Legends Roundtable, one of the developers of that is Brendan Robert, and the other thing that he's, I guess, known for recently is that he does the Jace emulator. Or I guess that's redundant. He does Jace, the Java Apple computer emulator, and that has lain dormant for a while. And so he announced recently that he's back to updating it and fixing some interface bugs and adding some new features. So look for that soon.
Yeah, that's great to see in our great big Lawless Legends episode, which is one of our favorites that we've done, actually, or one of my favorites that we've done. He mentioned he was threatening to resurrect Jace at some point because it was going to help them with the development of Lawless Legends. So perhaps that's the motivation there. Good to see that. And speaking of past episodes, we recently, of course, did the big Beagle Brothers Roundtable, which was very popular with listeners, and that was lots of fun to do. Well, wouldn't you know, very recently, the popular programming-related blog called Coding Horror, many of our listeners may know it, did a little post on Beagle Brothers, and he talks about how inspirational they were to him because they made what would possibly otherwise be somewhat dull software since they made a lot of utilities and such things. But they made it fun. As we all know, that was obviously our favorite thing about them as well, was their advertisements and their documentation and everything were all really fun. And so he talks a lot about that in this blog post. So, of course, we will link to that in the show notes. It's always nice to see Apple II content appear in random, unexpected places, and especially something as close to home as the Beagle Brothers.
And sadly, he doesn't mention our roundtable, but that's probably because he doesn't listen. And I'm sure it's coincidental, but it's a nice coincidence.
Yeah, I actually tried to go into his comment thread on that post and link to our show, but his comment system refused to let me log in. I was trying to create an account so I could post. It's one of these things where you have to have an account before you can post, and the account creation screen was just showing a broken 404. So after several attempts on different computers and different browsers, I gave up. The desire to plug the show was strong, but I'm afraid
but not that strong.
Yes, but not that strong. So hopefully someone else maybe will link him to our show.
All right. Well, I think that 2 hours later brings us to the end of our news section, but that's not the end of the show.
Yeah, we had lots of news, but I think now we've got some woos.
Don't call it that.
like Woz, and we know you do too. It's Woz News. It's Woos.
It's your segment. You call it. We have a bumper.
I was just kidding around with it.
But we have a bumper for it and everything now.
Yeah, you just heard it.
Well, I hope they heard it. If you edited it in properly.
I will paste it in. Yes.
All right. So our first Woos item. I hate that name.
Stop that.
Our first Woos item is kind of a retraction of sorts. A while back, we posted an article from the OC Register about.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's when you do this podcast and you're gathering up all these links. I will be honest, we don't always have the time to read them all very carefully before including them in the show because we're so enthusiastic to get all of the latest and greatest Apple II news to the listeners, and our editorial staff failed us on this one, I'm afraid. We had posted the article a couple of shows ago, I think it was, and it was, I guess, Steve Wozniak posting some very kind of alarmist sounding things about how computer technology is going off the rails and the world's going to end and cats and dogs living together and it's all going to be terrible.
One of these paragraphs reads that he blames the failure of the Apple II on the Apple III, which doesn't make any sense at all. Yes, we know the Apple III didn't do well, but I don't think Woz has ever said or even hinted that he felt that the Apple II was a failure. The interesting thing about this is that I think this is one of these articles where one person, probably at the OC Register, wrote this, and then everybody else kind of paid their license fee and just sort of reran it and changed the opening and closing paragraphs a little bit, because I kept seeing that same phrase over and over as I was skimming through this. Looking back, he blames Apple II's failure for the fact that it only allowed users to play games, which I don't think that's true.
Yeah, there's just so much in this article that's just rubbish, and yeah, that's kind of why I'm calling it a retraction. I sort of apologize for posting it in that episode where we did. It's the whole article there's a couple of quotes taken just way out of context to make some sort of fictional editorial point that the author wants to make, and it's just the whole thing is clickbait and way out of context quotes. It's just rubbish. It's not even journalism. It's just clickbait, internet trash.
It sort of paints him as a kind of a paranoid Luddite, which, not to keep bringing his appearance in 2013 at KansasFest up over and over again, but I remember while he was there, he's got like 3 or 4 cell phones. Like it's like the latest of each line, because he likes to play with these toys so much. And every time Apple releases something, he's down standing in a line at Los Gatos store or one of the other ones local to him, wherever he is. So I'm sure he thinks about technology a lot, but I doubt that he's really all that afraid of it.
No, I mean, we've all seen those images of his daily carry. He has this backpack that has like 13 computers and 58 cell phones and 6,000 chargers in it that he carries. And so, yeah, to characterize him as some sort of anti-technology Luddite is just ridiculous. And then, yeah, the things he says about the Apple II, quote, only being good for games, and just other just nonsensical things that he would never say and don't make any sense in any context. This whole article is just awful. And so we apologize for linking to that. But
we're sorry.
I blame Mike. So moving along to some more interesting stuff with Woz in the news. Not in the news, in fact, in a commercial. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's seen this, but Cadillac is running this series of TV commercials where they have various celebrities in them talking about the merits of the car or the company or whatever. They're sort of these kind of artistic meta ads that are popular now, where they don't actually talk about the product. They just talk about visions of the future and what products mean for humanity in a very general kind of sense. And of course, Woz is a good candidate for that sort of thing. So they have him in the commercial talking about his visions for computers and how he saw them changing the world, and has absolutely nothing to do with Cadillac. But it's Woz on screen doing his thing. So it's fun to watch it.
Its effects on society really came about not because I was selfish and wanted one for myself, which I did. It's because I had a passion my whole life. I wanted to teach myself to build computers. I wanted to build these things for free. I just wanted to do it for the world. And, when you want something, that's what you do the best.
I think the idea is that, they get the creative types and the visionaries and geniuses, and by having them talk about how they change the world, you're supposed to associate that with Cadillac. The thing is that Woz is such a public personality, I guess, and if you follow him on Twitter or Facebook or anything like that, he drives a Tesla. He does not drive a Cadillac, and I don't think after this he switched to Cadillac.
The great irony here is that Woz would never be a Cadillac person. He'd be all over the greatest coolest electric cars or whatever is the kind of high tech, kind of progressive type of thing. So it does not shock me at all that he drives a Tesla. I, on the other hand, drive a Nissan Leaf, which is the Tesla for the rest of us.
And the final woos item that we have is that we talked earlier about this new Jobs biopic being filmed. I guess the filming is wrapped now, but somebody asked him about his choice of cast, because he was kind of unhappy, with decisions made about the last film. So he comments, he says, "Casting is not my business. You can only really judge a cast after you see a movie. To me, it has to be an entertaining movie. In cases like this, at least partly documentary, there's a striving for closeness to reality, but it's not the only element that makes a movie entertaining. I'm happy, as I would be anyway. I'm especially happy to be played by," he calls him Josh Rogan, Seth Rogen, for multiple reasons. I hope that he turns in a stellar performance that moves him forward. So, we commented that, of course, the movie moved from Sony over to Universal Pictures, and Woz, while it was at Sony, was the script consultant, and Universal opted not to pick up that contract. So he's not involved with the film anymore, but it sounds like he's at least more upbeat about this than he was about the last one.
That's really funny that he got his name wrong. I'm guessing he's not actually following these proceedings that closely. How about you, Mark? Are you planning to see any of these, or this Jobs movie, or have you seen any of the other 84 that have been made?
It seems like you could do a whole film festival of, retelling the same story again and again. And I'm not sure how that would be. The new one looks like it's going to be fun. I do like that they have, Woz included as a significant character. As was discussed on previous episodes of the podcast, you get the feeling that the focus is going to be on latter day Jobs, but that's okay.
That's funny. I wouldn't be shocked if someone does end up doing a Jobs film festival at some point. It would be a funny idea. I will not be in attendance.
I think actually everyone would not be in attendance. So.
Yes, if theaters are listening, don't bother doing that. I think we're all pretty tired of these Jobs movies. I might see this one because I do kind of like Seth Rogen, and he does make kind of a funny looking Woz, but I'm not in a hurry to go see these.
I'd rather watch a film festival of all the old Apple commercials.
Yes, that I would go to. There's some fun ones. In fact, I assume you've seen, there's a YouTube channel that's I think it's literally called Every Apple TV Commercial Ever or something like that. Have you guys seen this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
a pretty fun one. Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes because that's a fun one. It goes all the way back. And there's some dedicated fans out there archiving all this stuff. All right, well, that's lots of news and lots of woos, and we also have lots of feedback. This is what happens when we go so long between recordings. So let's roll into that, shall we?
You've listened to us talk. Now it's time to tell us what you think.
All right, our first email comes from Brian Weiser, who many people will know from KFest. He's a regular there and also active in the Apple II Enthusiasts Facebook group. He says, "Hi, Mike and Quinn. Thanks for taking the time to acknowledge A2 Central and Sean's efforts. We recently did kind of a tribute to Sean. He was expressing in the Facebook group that he was struggling a bit to keep up with A2 Central. So we sent lots of love his way to keep doing that. So Brian says, A2 Central, along with the news groups, was how I discovered the Apple II community many years ago. And I'm sure Sean, like many of us, often feels that his archival and news efforts are overlooked or underappreciated. So it's great you went to such great lengths. I know that other people are part of A2 Central, and Sean has been the driving force for quite a while. And he says also, thanks for mentioning callapple.org. Bill and I are expanding our news coverage beyond Apple II to include current Apple and related technologies that will be of interest to a larger audience. So I assume that means Mac and iPhone and such things. We are also seeking volunteers for writing if you happen to know anyone who is interested. So if any of our listeners have an urge to write for Call Apple, by all means, get in touch with Brian over there at Call Apple. Our next email comes from listener Peter, and he says, "Hi, Mike and Quinn. I've been a user of Apple IIs since elementary school, way back in the early 80s. I have owned and tinkered with an Apple IIgs since grade 12. Hooray, Apple IIgs. I just recently discovered your podcast. And anyway, I was listening to your episode 41. Funny how you mentioned Burnaby, BC in this episode, because he currently lives there. And he says he thinks he's found a download link for Apple GEOS images on Asimov. So we talked a while back about GEOS, and we weren't at the time able to find download links for it. And I think we've since posted them. We did get some listeners write to us to provide links for that. So thank you, Peter. We will definitely provide that link as well in the show notes. And I think, Mike, you and I have talked about doing a GEOS episode, have we not?
Yeah, we probably should. It's, I think, well, it's not the only graphical user interface for the Apple II, but it was by far the most popular.
Definitely, yeah. And you and I were both big fans of it, so we've toyed with the idea of dedicating an entire episode to GEOS, and I think, we should definitely do that. I want to do it. Mark, did you ever use GEOS?
I did use GEOS, and at some point, I when my sister went off to college, I set her up with a 2C Plus and a GEOS environment, and she did WordPressing on that, I think, for most of her time at college. I was pretty happy with it. I mean, you got a lot of the ease of use that a certain other Apple line was getting credit for, on much less expensive hardware.
For sure. It was really quite remarkably powerful for an 8-bit Apple II. And I was the same way all through school. I used GEOS for all of my school papers and projects and things. I really, really loved it. My only complaint about it was that it was sort of a walled garden. It had all its own file formats and disk formats and everything. So the data is very difficult to get out into any other format. I don't know if it's possible. So we'll have to explore that in our future dedicated to GEOS episode, which we are definitely doing now. All right, moving right along, we've got another email from listener Vladimir, and he says, "Hi guys and girls, awesome show as always. Don't be so gloomy." He's referencing the source code for Pinball Construction Set for the Atari that we linked to. I believe it was in the last show. And we had mentioned that we talked about it because Bill Budge had used the Apple II in his development pipeline for the Atari version of Pinball Construction Set. And Vladimir points out that actually the source code for the Apple II version of Pinball Construction Set is also available. So he links to that. Turns out Bill Budge has a GitHub page with source code on it from his Apple II days, which is super awesome, and I did not know this existed. So thank you very much, Vladimir. We will definitely be linking to that in the show notes.
We need to get that guy on the show.
Yes, we've had people ask to have him on the show, and rest assured, listeners, we have been trying. We've been working the network, as it were, to try and get him on the show. And if he's listening, please respond to all those mutual friends that I've had trying to bug you. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show before, but I actually worked with Bill at the 3DO company. I was there for a while. And a bunch of the old EA people and actually old Atari people as well had come over to 3DO from EA when Trip Hawkins left to start 3DO. And he brought a lot of the sort of senior engineers with him, and Bill Budge was there. So I worked, he was in the tools group that wrote this kind of central stuff that lots of different projects used. And so I got to meet him a couple times. And I'll be honest, I was geeking out pretty badly. It was ostensibly, I think we were talking about, I was trying to use his math library and something on our project, and so I'm standing there trying to ask him questions, and my brain is just exploding because I'm standing here talking to Bill Budge. He was in.
That's just precisely why he doesn't come on shows like this.
Probably, I'm sure it would be very, very embarrassing for him. There may have been some squeeing going on. I think I mostly contained it, but he was, like I say, in another department, so I didn't have a lot of close interaction with him. But I definitely crossed paths with him a couple of times, long before Open Apple. Anyway, so that because of that, I have some sort of we have some mutual acquaintances, which I've been leaning on to try and get him on the show, but no luck so far. All right, well, speaking of Apple II celebrities, we got an email from Jessie Blue, and that is a name that I hope every 2GS person out there knows, of Ninja Force fame. You may have seen his name in shoutouts and making shoutouts in various scrolling texts in awesome 2GS demos, of which Mike would know nothing about. And so we got an email from him, which is...
What?
Got an email from him, and he's one of these people that I always was really fascinated by because he produced these amazing 2GS demos that at the time were just sort of magic to me, and I never really could quite conceive of how they were written. Anyway, he says, nice episode in reference to our Ben Heck episode. He says Ben Heck failed to mention exactly how much he would charge for a GS laptop. For anyone who missed the show or doesn't recall, we had Ben Hackendorn on the show to talk about his 2GS laptop that he built back in 2008. And he has stated many times in many different ways that he will never be making another one. And we, of course, as our duty to the listeners, asked him anyway if he would make one. And we, of course, I think got the answer no. I think we got him to admit if there was enough money that he might do it. No one will say no to a dump truck full of money, but I suspect the cost for doing so would be more than anyone would be willing to pay. He's a busy guy, and his time is valuable. Nevertheless, maybe someday, right? Of course, Mike, you wouldn't want a 2GS laptop anyway.
No, I would just smash it.
Would you order one from Ben Heck just to smash it?
I would, yes, and I put it on YouTube.
You'd be that guy. Well, he might make an Apple III laptop because he likes interesting and unusual projects that he hasn't done before. So he might be able to talk him into making an Apple III.
Certainly unusual. I don't know if you could cram all those chips into a little laptop, though. That is a really crowded motherboard.
Plus, when you were done, there would be only 2 pieces of software you could run on it.
Yeah, and then you'd have to pick it up and drop it every 20 minutes.
That's right.
Not because it actually overheats. He just builds that in there so that you can experience what it would be like to use an Apple III.
Definitely, yeah. He would have to put a little accelerometer in there, so every so often, yeah, you would have to drop it. That would be amazing, actually. I would like to see that. All right, and last but not least, we have an email from listener Duggenstein, which sounds like some sort of universal monster version of some guy named Doug. Duggenstein says, great podcast, guys, and girl, I hope, is implied there. I recently purchased a 2GS that I have wanted since it first came out. Oh, bravo. However, my system doesn't see the 3.5-inch floppy drives due to a cracked socket on the motherboard for the VGC chip. That's unfortunate. Please keep adding more 2GS topics as there are no podcasts related just to that machine. That is true. Well,
I think that's a plan. I think you wrote that, and nobody actually wrote it and said that.
It could be a plan, because he then goes on to talk about one of my favorite topics within the 2GS genre, which is the Task Force swear hack. He says, Task Force with the adult language hack, we linked recently to the Task Force swear hack after a listener managed to image it off of a disk. Following our episode where we talked about it at length, and I mourned the possible loss of it to the sands of time since I had only ever seen my own copy of it and wasn't able to image it. So we linked to that as a Shrinkit archive, and he says since he doesn't have a Mac and runs his 2GS in emulation, he asks, is there a non-Shrinkit format available that I can obtain, such as an uncompressed disk image? Thanks. Keep up the great podcasts and Happy New Year. Okay, well, it is New Year. So this is an interesting question, how to get a Shrinkit archive from the internet into something usable on real hardware or as a disk image in emulation. What are your thoughts on that?
This is where buying something like the CFFA card or one of these other emulators comes in handy, because you can just throw your disk image onto your SD card and stick it in there. And I don't know if he's trying to boot from it or not, but all you got to do on the 2GS is get into GSOS, and then you can use, I think Asimov is the name of the utility, or Shrinkit or something like that, to reconstitute that image back into a floppy disk, or load it on your hard drive. If you were fortunate enough to be able to buy, the Ethernet card, you can use that on your local area network for file transfer, and you can transfer it that way with FTP. But other than that, yeah, it gets kind of difficult.
Yeah, there are some modern desktop archive utilities that will do Shrinkit as well. So there's definitely one for the Mac, which I'll link to in the show notes. I think there should be one for PCs as well. I feel like I've seen one somewhere along the way, but I'm not sure. So that's another option, is just to open the archive on a modern machine and transfer it into the emulator that way, or something along those lines. So hopefully that was helpful. And if not, maybe a user will make a disk image for you, and we can link to that in the next episode. All right, well, that is all we have for feedback this month.
Actually, we have one more.
Oh, I
do have one more.
I take that back.
Andrew Rowan, who was on our show last month talking about Oz K-Fest, wrote in to point out that I talked about the Halley project and how that's a great example of a good educational game as opposed to some of the other garbage that was out there for the Apple II. There is a computer gaming world. It's number 26 from March of 1986 that has a nice review on that game, and you can download that entire magazine in PDF format from the Computer Gaming World Museum, and it's about 20 megabytes, so it's not huge, and you can read it as you play it.
Excellent. And I guess we should also mention that on Facebook and other areas, we got a lot of positive feedback on the Beagle Brothers reunion roundtable that we did. So thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for that, everyone.
A lot of email that people really love that, and we loved making that. So again, thanks to the Beagles for showing up and hanging out with us.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to make. I think Beagle Brothers is dear to everybody, every Apple II user's heart. Mark, did you know and love Beagle Brothers back in the day?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that my favorite single piece of material that they produced, I mean, I love the packaging and the ads and the software too, but let's be honest here. The slip covers for the 5-inch discs had on the back of them all kinds of icons for the, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this with this diskette. And it was sort of a parody of the standard, don't expose it to magnetic fields, don't puncture it. Instead, it had, don't feed it to an alligator and don't put it down the toilet and things like this. But they did it in exactly the same style. And if you just glanced at it, you just go right past it. But I love those. And I think I still have some of those. Those are a treasure.
Yeah, they really are. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, we should try and find an image of that and link to it in the show notes, because they are just hysterical. Yeah, their advertisements and materials in general just had a lot of sort of comedic Easter eggs like that you might not notice on first glance. And the how to handle a floppy disk warnings that they snuck in there were definitely hysterical. So we'll try and find an image of that and link to it. All right, so I think that wraps up our user feedback, unless you have anything else, Mike.
That's all I have. Let's talk about some eBay stuff.
All right, on this show where we don't talk about eBay.
Look, rare! Steve Jobs. Look what we found on eBay.
So a while back, we were talking about Apple IIc bags, those carrying bags that everybody loves. And I had bought one myself not too long ago on eBay for what I thought was a really good deal. And then turns out I probably overpaid, as many of us do on eBay. Mike, you emailed me with this funny information the other day. Why don't you tell us what you found?
Oh, so a little background. My dad had one of those early Apple PowerBooks, and he had it in this leather laptop bag, and the bag had a little, the rainbow Apple logo. It was actually like a plastic one that had been set into the leather, and I thought, man, it'd be cool to have one of those again. So I went to eBay, and the result was that I sent Quinn an email and said, so type this into eBay search engine, and the term was rainbow Apple laptop bag, and you get a bunch of the more modern ones, the kind that I was looking for, but you also get a ton of these Apple IIc laptop bags where the owners don't know what they are, and so they're selling them for like $20, $25. And then I said, and then go ahead and clear your search out and just search for Apple IIc bag. And there was like 3 listings, and they were started at like $85 or something. So I thought that was kind of a really funny example of how easy it is to miss stuff. Just if you get a couple of search terms wrong in the eBay search engine.
For sure. eBay, as I think many regular users know, is is often the best deals nowadays. I mean, the dealers and stuff are really savvy on there now. So the best deals are generally from someone who doesn't know what they have, and or someone who has mislisted something. So sometimes it pays to search for, the thing you want, but misspell it in various ways, because you'll find that item that nobody else is finding because the terms are misspelled, or things that are listed in the wrong category. Go search in the antique section instead of the vintage computing section, things like that. But it takes a lot of time sometimes to find those poorly listed items that are the best deals. So sometimes, like you say, you stumble on this search term that just produces exactly what you want. And needless to say, I cried a little bit when I saw all these beautiful Apple IIc bags, many of which are in better condition than mine and are a third of the price. So if anyone out there is looking for an Apple IIc bag and you want to pay a third of what I did, go search for Rainbow Apple Laptop Bag, and you will be pleasantly surprised.
Well, I didn't mean to make you feel bad, Quinn. I think I noticed this phenomena the first time when I was searching for some Apple III stuff, actually. And if so in eBay, when you're searching for Apple III, it's Apple, and then it's 3 capital letter I's or small letter I's. But I've noticed that people, and I haven't seen this in a long time, I'm sure they figured it out by now, but sometimes somebody will list it and it'll be Apple, but it'll be 3 L's, which look like the capital I's, or 3 1's.
Oh, wow. Clever. Okay, I haven't tried that. Yeah, I've got a search term that I'm sure most of us do this, where you do like Apple II with the number 2, and then II, and then capital II, and those variations, and 2E with the 2.
Yep.
But yeah, I never thought about the 1s and the L's. Wow. Sneaky. All right, well, that's all the eBay that we have for this month, which is good because we don't talk about eBay on this show. What we do talk about, is weird games.
Choplifter, Load Runner, but do you know this? It's time for a weird game.
So, Mike, why don't you start us off with your pick this month?
My pick is a game called Super Martian, the Adventure. I don't remember a lot about this other than that it was an odd game that I saw back in high school and had basically forgotten about because I don't really see it in a lot of places. It's made by a company called Computer Easy, and I bet this is probably one of, 3 products that they made or something. But it's an adventure game, and check it out.
And you should also check it out because they have a really funny sounding URL, mockag.
Well, I think that's actually the Museum of Computer Adventure Game History.
No, I'm pretty sure it's mockag. I think that's how they would intend that to be pronounced. All right. So once again, you managed to pull one out that I have definitely not heard of. So well done, you. My pick this month is one that some people may have heard of, but it's definitely weird, which is why I love it. It's called Knights of Legend, and it was definitely one of my favorite Apple II games. It's the kind of game that you just don't see anymore because it required a level of dedication to play that I think no one these days would ever put up with. So the thing shipped on, if I recall correctly, 8 floppy disks, both sides, so 16 sides, and it was so ambitious, this game. It's hard to sort of explain how ambitious this game was. It was just too big for an Apple II, I think is the way to say it. It's sort of I guess what would be considered a typical RPG nowadays, where you're traveling across the land with your party of adventurers and you're equipping them with various things and increasing their skills by battling monsters and so on. But just every single aspect of this game is just insanely detailed. So, for example, there's every single piece of equipment keeps track of its own damage, and it wears out and your swords get dull, and every character's limbs are all tracked for how, if you have bruises on your legs or whatever, it keeps track of all that. And the combat sequences are these just massive, elaborate affairs where you're moving your party through towns and in and out of buildings one step at a time. And when you engage with an enemy, you're choosing combat moves. Literally, you're choosing among multiple different types of sword swing, and then defending with multiple different types of sidestep and lean maneuvers and shield maneuvers. Every single swing of your sword requires, 6 or 7 choices in a series of nested menus. And so you can imagine a single combat literally takes several hours in this game. So to complete the game, I don't know, I can't even imagine how many hundreds or probably thousands of hours it would require to actually finish this game. I played a lot of it, but never even made a dent in it. And if that wasn't enough, the actual time commitment of playing the game, because it was on so many discs and it was so elaborate, there was a lot of loading in this game. So you spent a lot of time flipping and swapping discs around. Even with 2 floppy drives, you spent a lot of time flipping and swapping discs. In fact, for example, there was this there was an inventory screen where you could see like a group photo of your party kind of close up and filled the screen. It was super cool. You'd see all your equipment and everything that you had on everybody. Made this really nice group photo of everybody. But to do that, you had to swap discs several times while that screen was loading to give you a sense of this. So if you ever wanted to see the group photo of your party, you would select the menu option, and then you would go through a series of swapping and flipping discs around while it did who knows what, presumably, I don't know, loading images of equipment, or I don't know what it was doing. And that's kind of how this game went from start to finish. You were just swapping discs every time something happened. So it was, it's like I say, it's the kind of game that would never fly today, but it was the kind of game that I loved back then, not just because of the detail, but in those days you used to measure the quality of a game by how thick the manual was, and this thing was a beast. It must have been an inch thick. It was a novel, this thing. It had massive, elaborate tables of equipment and how different things interacted with different races, and if you're a dark elf from this particular region and you're this age, then this particular sword does this particular damage to this particular type of enemy in this situation or that situation if it's nighttime in the spring. And the level of detail was absolutely insane. And it was all laid out in the manual for your min-maxing pleasure. So for all of these reasons and many more, it's the kind of game that could only have existed in this particular weird time at the end of the 80s. Yeah, the learning curve was steep and the commitment required was high. Not everybody's cup of tea for sure. But as Apple II games go, it really was fantastic. Visually, it was a sight to behold. It was really a lovely looking game. It had a graphical interface with cool iconographic buttons, and when you're moving around in towns, your party was represented by this kind of 3D helmet that rotated back and forth. The attention to detail and the graphics just everywhere was really fantastic. For if you're wondering how good an Apple II game can really look, I think this is the game to look at. Just beautiful. So if you like these kinds of sort of Western style RPG games, this is definitely one to try. And it might be possible nowadays to set up an emulator that could play this really well without all of the waiting for loading and disk swapping. I would have to look into that. It might be possible to set up an emulator with 8 floppy drives and set up some flags that it wouldn't have to wait for the virtual loading times and all that. Definitely one that I think people should check out. Do either of you guys, have you ever heard of this game?
I've heard of it. I remember seeing ads for it in the magazine, but I don't think I ever played it.
Okay, yeah, they ran a lot of ads for this game. They were definitely pushing it. I think it was a real kind of marquee title for them at the time, I think. But yeah, it definitely didn't seem to do very well. So that's Knights of Legend. That's my pick for this month's Weird Game.
And the PDF that I was looking for Super Martian finally loaded, so I will tell you a little bit more about the game. So like I said, it's an adventure game. Oh, and the great thing is that it's not copy protected. So you can, that's not as much of an issue now. I always loved companies that, they say right in the beginning of the manual, go ahead and back this up. So that's a great thing. A plus for Computer Easy. I don't, like I said, don't know whatever happened to them. The game came out in 1987, which is pretty late in the run of 8-bit Apple IIs. Maybe why it didn't get much traction. I do remember enjoying it quite a bit. The story is that Super Martian came to Earth in an effort to escape the hostilities which were ravaging his home planet of Mars. His Martian name is unpronounceable by human tongues, yet the letters on his suit resemble the English letters M and S in that order. He never bothered to change the order of the letters to fit his Earth name, Super Martian, which makes no sense at all. The first creature that Super Martian met upon his arrival to Earth was a stray dog called Tops. You are the first human that Super Martian has really taken an interest in. In fact, you are the most intelligent creature he has ever met on Earth. One day, Tops wandered away and became lost. Super Martian asked you to accompany him on a journey to find the lost dog. So this whole thing is about you and Super Martian trying to find this dumb dog. And it's silly and it's fun, and it's definitely not It's not going to rank up there with the classic Infocom games as far as masterful storytelling or writing or anything like that, but it's fun. And like I said, it's one that, like, if you type Super Martian the Adventure into Google and put quotes around it, I think you get like 4 results, something. So it's not a common game that I think everyone's heard of.
All right, so that's it for Weird Gaming. Let's move on to tech, shall we?
Fasten your seat bits and warm up your soldering irons. It's time to talk tech.
So this month in tech, it's been a while actually, so I guess since we've done a tech segment. So what I thought I'd talk about this month is something that I think might be helpful to a lot of Apple II developers like myself. And what I've got here is a collection of bookmarks. Back in the day, of course, we would have programmed the Apple II with a giant stack of books next to us with pages dog-eared and post-it notes marking important things everywhere. But nowadays, I program with a whole bunch of tabs open in my browser for reference. So I wanted to link to the set that I've been using. I've basically settled on this particular set of references for things that I use while programming Apple II stuff. So the first one is the CA65 User's Guide. So if, like me, you're cross-developing for the Apple II, then CA65 may be your development environment of choice. It certainly is mine. I'm a big fan. So I keep the reference guide for that handy. It's got all the syntax for the assembler directives and all the little, tricks for labels that it will do and so on. So that's a good thing to have handy. The next one I have is from a site called NTL World, and it's a 6502 reference, and it's actually a Commodore 64 site, and it's intended for like Commodore demo scene programmers. But what I like about it is just the format of it. Obviously, it's 6502, so it's relevant to us, and it's got a really nice layout. Everything is nicely linked within the reference. You can see how all the instructions relate to each other and all the addressing modes, and it's got a nice kind of pseudocode section for each instruction, so you can see how it behaves. If for no other reason, the best part about this link is that under the compare instruction, it has a little table that explains, if you want to compare two numbers and branch based on, whether they're less than or equal to and they're signed numbers, or they're greater than and they're unsigned, or, not equal to and they're signed, or, all the different combinations of comparisons that you might do with numbers and signed and unsigned. It explains what kind of compare you do and what kind of branch you do. And that's just awesome, because it's sometimes a little mind-bending to think, okay, I want to do a less than or equal to, and their numbers are signed, so then I got to do a BMI, and then I got to do a BQ, and, it's a little bit brain-melting sometimes exactly how the branches interact with the various status flags in the CPU. So, yeah, this little chart is awesome, so I will definitely link to that. The next one I use is a site called 6502 Coding Algorithms. And this is a nice quick reference for the kinds of things that you commonly do that are sort of a hassle on the 6502. Things like moving 16-bit chunks around, 16-bit math, 32-bit math, logical operations on large chunks, moving chunks of memory around. So kind of common operations that you would do that are more than a few instructions. And these are obviously all solved problems. Lots of people smarter than me have come along and figured out what the fastest way to do it in a particular situation is. So this is kind of a quick reference for all that kind of stuff. Kind of a cookbook for 6502 sorts of tasks that you might need to do. The next one I have in the list is an AppleSoft Basic reference. This is really great if you're doing any kind of real low-level stuff with AppleSoft Basic. It's got things like the AppleSoft error codes and all the different peeks and pokes, and it's also just a kind of a nice reference to all the AppleSoft basic functions, what they all do, and so on. Good for the average AppleSoft programmer, but also for low-level stuff if you're doing any kind of dark and dirty AppleSoft things. And the next one is a site from a fellow named Terrence J. Bolt, and he has kind of a cool Apple II programming site that has a lot of the more esoteric things in it. It's got, things like Apple Talk on the 2GS and how to program an image writer, or how to program with the Smart Port, how to detect the vertical blank on an Apple II, how to work with the mouse, on the Apple IIe and 2C. So these kinds of things that are kind of hard to find information on, frankly. He's got a really great summary of a lot of these sorts of more esoteric topics. So that's also a great reference that I keep handy. And the next one is a 65 CO2 reference. I use that Commodore page that I mentioned for most of my reference, but of course the 2E Enhanced and 2C have these 65 CO2 in them, which has a few extra instructions and addressing modes, which are awesome. So I keep that around just so I can reference, keep in my mind what the extra modes are on the 65 CO2 if you're targeting those later Apple II platforms. And of course, I would use this one all the time, but it's honestly, it's not as good as the Commodore page is as far as how the instructions are cross-referenced and so on. So, moving along, the next one is an FAQ from apple2.org.za, which it's similar to that other site I mentioned where it's kind of a deep dive on some of the more obscure topics like mouse programming and some of the low-level Disk 2 stuff and that kind of stuff. So again, obscure low-level stuff. I think it's kind of like an FAQ of collected wisdom from CSA2, something like that. And the last one I've got here is a site that we've mentioned on the show before called Jamtronics. And what I love about this is he's got the complete source listing for AppleSoft Basic. And it's all on one page, no weird pagination that you have to click through. It's all on one page, it's all searchable, and it's all hyperlinked. So you can click from one label to another within the jump instructions and so on. It's just, if you're doing any kind of low-level stuff with AppleSoft, if you want to interact with AppleSoft from assembly language in any way at all, this is a must-have reference. I think there is no better AppleSoft source code listing on the internet. So I keep that handy as well, and of course that will be in this link collection. So that's it. I keep, like I'm sure many browsers do this, Safari has this thing where you can have a collection of links as a single bookmark, and you just click that bookmark and it opens a window with all those tabs. And I use that feature for this. So when I'm doing my Apple II programming, I click that button and I get all my references right there. What I would have given for that ability in 1987 or whatever.
Mark, do you have any favorite programming references?
Oh my goodness. Mine are, since I sort of took a hiatus from the 6502 coding, many of the things that I found when I jump back into it are some of the same ones that Quinn mentioned. But now I'm like frantically scribbling these all down. These are great. Quinn, I did have one question for you. You're talking about the different models of the 6502 and whether you're targeting like, an Apple II or later, or an Apple IIe or later, and so on. Because I just wrote and released this open source library, and I wanted it to be as broadly applicable as possible, I stuck to the original 6502 instruction set and did not use any of all that fancy newfangled stuff. I'm curious, Quinn, whether you find yourself making those kinds of decisions as you're coding also.
It depends on what I'm writing, I guess. I think kind of like modern software, I want to target the lowest possible level of Apple II that can do what I want. So if I was writing something basic like a disk utility or something, I would definitely code it to the Apple II Plus sort of architecture. I wouldn't go any lower than that. I don't think we need to support, the original 4K Apple II or whatever, but a 48K 2 Plus is kind of a good min spec, I think, for any Apple II project. But my current project, which I'm going to be debuting at KansasFest this year, is definitely has some higher requirements.
That's the one with the interrupts that you're not talking about?
Yes, exactly. So that has some higher requirements. So I just went ahead and I'm just targeting the 2E Enhanced and newer with that, which I think honestly covers the bulk of the Apple II community these days anyway. You 2 Plus users can send your hate mail to Mike for that one. But so yeah, it's a tough call. I had originally visions of doing this project and supporting the 2 Plus, but about a quarter of the way into it, it quickly became apparent that supporting the 2 Plus for this particular type of project was going to basically double the workload, and it's enough of a project as it is. So I made the hard choice to drop that support. I think it was worth doing in this particular case because, it made the rest of the code so much better. It allowed me to just totally unlock, the power of the 65 CO2 and go nuts with all the new instructions, and the code got faster and smaller. And I could go nuts with using extended memory and all these sorts of things that, of course, you can't do on the 2 Plus. So, it's case-by-case basis. I think it's nice to support the 2 Plus if you can. But if it's going to ultimately hurt the project or add so much development time that you won't finish the project, then I don't think it's worth it. So I don't have any hard numbers on this, but I feel like most of the Apple II community these days is probably using a 2E enhanced or newer, but like I say, I don't have any actual data to back that up.
It was something that I gave a fair amount of thought to, and as I was writing the very innermost unrolled data transfer loops for sending data out to these programmed LEDs, I found myself, sort of mentally taking two paths at the same time. One is, how do I do this on the classic 6502, and how do I do it on the CO2? And ultimately, there was not a big difference there. We're mostly bottlenecked on just getting the bits out the door. But I found myself debating that. I think you're right, though. I think targeting the CO2 is not crazy these days.
Some of the 65 CO2 stuff is fairly trivial, like, it's nice, the STZ instruction is nice, saves you an instruction when you're initializing things and so on, but that's fairly trivial to just not use that. But some of the, more sophisticated addressing modes, especially for indirect jumping and so on, that they added in the CO2, I think really does make it worthwhile in a lot of projects. So especially if you're doing any kind of fancy graphics or anything like that. So case by case, I guess.
The store zero instruction not only saves you an opcode, but it reduces the register pressure because you can keep some other value around in a register.
Yeah, that's true.
I deal with compiler internals for a living, so I think about this stuff.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, for sure, yeah. It would be interesting to see what maybe people can write in and say if they're adamant 2+ users, I guess, write in and let us know. And, depending on what you're doing, it can get difficult to support the whole model range on the high end as well, certain types of things. So, for example, the project that I'm talking about here has mouse support in it. It turns out supporting the mouse on all iterations of the Apple II that could support a mouse is quite a bit of work. There was the Apple IIe mouse card, which can be in any of several slots. And then there was the Apple IIc, which had several ROM revisions. And in virtually every single ROM revision, I think there was like 4 of them, they moved the mouse firmware. So thanks, Apple. So it turns out writing, and not only that, the mouse timing is different. The mouse on the 2C versus the 2E mouse card. So the 2C actually scales the pulse train differently. Yeah, long story short, it's actually quite an alarming amount of work to write a block of code that works on every single possible Apple II that might have a mouse on it. So I'm debating actually doing a KansasFest session on this because it took quite a while to work all that out and come up with a block of code that does work. I'll certainly be sharing the code if anyone wants to add mouse support, just so no one else has to suffer the way I have suffered this year coming up with this thing. But yeah, so if you're trying to do that on the high end, then also trying to do some support for the 2+ on the low end, it gets to a point where you have to pick your battles anyway.
I can only imagine. I haven't quite gone there yet, but thank you for your contributions there.
All right, so moving along, this is something that a lot of retro outlets have been discussing, but it's kind of neat from an Apple II standpoint. It's this thing called Disco Runner. It is ostensibly a multi-dialect BASIC interpreter, but as far as I can tell, it only does AppleSoft BASIC. If you're going to support BASICs of many flavors, I can't think of a better one to start with. It's not an emulator exactly, but it's more like a runtime environment for BASIC, and specifically so far AppleSoft. So it's sort of an odd thing. I'm not exactly sure what I would do with it that I wouldn't just do in Virtual 2, because it does primarily just emulate an AppleSoft environment, and it has just enough hardware support that you can do some graphics and things with it. But it's not emulating the whole Apple II. It's just kind of emulating enough of the environment so that you can use the graphics-related commands. It's kind of a weird thing. It goes one step further and has some weird features where you can actually, so it renders the graphics screens in 3D geometry. And so you can actually pan the camera around and look at your low-res pixels from behind and various other weird things like this. So yeah, it's an odd duck, this thing. Anyway, but I thought I would mention it just because it's AppleSoft BASIC related. Now, Mike, you've got something in the tech segment here for, I think, the first time ever. Do you want to talk about that?
Hey. First, we owe our French friends over at Brutal Deluxe an apology. Antoine wrote to remind me that we still had not mentioned their release of Merlin 32. that came out, I think, in early January, maybe. So, Antoine, I'm very sorry that it took us this long to talk about it. Merlin 32 is an Apple II assembly language environment, but it's for Windows. And as with everything else that they've released, he's got a nice long tech write-up over at their webpage. And surprisingly, for somebody like me who hasn't done a lot of assembly programming, it's still really easy to follow.
We've definitely been remiss in not mentioning Merlin 32. It's super cool. For anyone who may not be familiar with, of course, Merlin being the original not from Apple assembler, and I think most Apple programmers would agree from back in the day it was the best one. Everyone I know who was sort of a serious assembly programmer used Merlin. And Merlin then became Merlin 8, which then on the 2GS they added Merlin 16. So that's where the name comes from. It's hence Merlin 32 on the modern computers. And yeah, it's, I'm not a Windows user, but I have certainly looked at this product a little bit, and I'm sure it would run under Parallels or whatever just fine. And it's really excellent. It's a really nice assembler. And, Brutal Deluxe is doing more in the 2GS cross-development space by far than anybody else. They've just come up with this awesome set of tools, and we can't say enough good things about them. So good to, plug Merlin 32. Better late than never, and we will certainly link to it in the show notes.
While we're talking about it, I am a little confused. This actually kind of dovetails nicely into what I've been doing on the Apple II recently, and that's I've got the Robert Mottola assembly language programming for the Apple II, and I've been diving into that, and I've been trying to pick the right version of assembler. And there's Merlin 8, there's Merlin 8.16, there's Merlin 8.16 Plus, there's Merlin Pro, and I don't know which one I should be using.
Yeah, there are a lot of different iterations of Merlin over the years. Now, are you wanting to program directly on the Apple II? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to start with, because it's just simple stuff that I'm doing at this point. If I ever get to the point where I'm doing a serious project, then I'll switch over to CC65 or something like that. But
I think I would just start with Merlin 8, honestly. It's a classic for a reason. I certainly used it lots back in the day. Of course, if you're on the 2GS, I would say Merlin 16, but yeah, I think just original classic Merlin 8. Merlin, was originally just Merlin, and then they renamed it Merlin 8 when the later versions started coming out. So I think if you look for Merlin 8, you'll probably find the last sort of version of it that ran on the 8-bits alone, and that would ensure that you had all the bug fixes and features and stuff that were added to it. So I'm not familiar with Merlin 8.16. It's possible that is a still newer version that ran on the 8-bits still, but Merlin 8 would definitely be a good choice, I think.
All right. Well, I will give that a shot.
Cool. Yeah, let me know how that goes. It's, I think, in my humble opinion, a bit of a masochist exercise in this day and age to write assembly on the machine itself.
Sure.
Just because, we're so spoiled by big screens. And the thing about assembly language is that, every mistake you make brings the whole machine down. So you spend a lot of time rebooting. Yeah, definitely keep me posted on that. I'm curious to see how it goes for someone kind of learning Apple II assembly language for the first time.
Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, and I guess we have one more item, and that's mine, and it's sort of a little teaser, sneak preview, if you will. Obviously, Reactive Micro has been slumbering for quite some time now. Henry and Anthony, the guys behind it, they shut the shop down, I guess a couple of years now it's been, and said, hey, we'll be back at some point. They wanted to do some other projects, and they've been helping David Schmick recently get the Apple II Pi card produced, and Henry has sent along a couple of things for me to play with that I get to tell you about. The first is the No Slot Clock 2C, which is a low-profile no slot clock that they've created that'll fit better in the 2C. It gets kind of tight and under that keyboard there. The neat thing about it is it also has a replaceable battery, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And he sent along the Transwarp GS oscillator. It's a scalable oscillator, so you don't have to swap out the oscillator every single time you want to change speeds on your 2GS.
So just so we're clear here, they sent you samples of these devices?
They did, yes.
Wow. I am insanely jealous, let me just say. That's fantastic.
part of me mentioning this was hopefully that Henry will hear this and go, "Oh, Quinn wants one of these too," and we'll send some your way to review.
Yes, I don't know if the no slot clock also works in the 2C Plus, but if it does, yes, I would absolutely love one. I'm super excited by that device. So it's a really awesome design.
So no prices or anything announced at this point, but those will be going into production soon.
Awesome.
So with me today, I have Sean Fahey, who runs a2central.com, and you've probably seen him in A2 Central chat if you hang out there, and all the places where Apple II hobbyists hang out. Hello, Sean. How are you?
Hey, Mike. Doing pretty good.
Good. And you and I are here tonight because we have some fun stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I got some cool stuff from Ultimate Apple II and Reactive Micro.
Yeah, I got 2 items. Did you get the same things that I did?
I think I did. I got the no slot clock and the scalable oscillator.
Yeah, so I got both of those too, and let's see, we've both had them. Well, I've had mine for I guess about a week now, and I've had a chance to install them and play with it. But first, I'd like to hear your opinions. Let's start with the no slot clock. How did that work for you?
It worked pretty good. I like it that it's much more lower profile. Mm-hmm. And that made it just barely squeaked into the Apple IIc with the Apple IIc memory card. Yeah.
I have the Chinook card, which I think is a clone of the actual Apple card. Right. And I had the same experience that you did. It fits. It's tight, but it does fit in there, which is nice because those old Dallas. The old Dallas Electronics or whatever the company's name is, those didn't fit in the Apple IIc if you had your memory card in there.
Right, too tall.
Yep. And I like also that this has a replaceable battery, which I think is just really awesome.
Yeah, it's a big plus. I don't think anyone will ever have to buy another Dallas E chip ever again.
Well, yeah, and I think they stopped making them, I don't know, 5 or 7 years ago now, something like that. So,
well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't think they're available new anymore, which kind of sucks because you have to, at least my experience is, maybe I'm just not looking in the right place, but my experience now is that you got to get them from eBay, and there are a couple of sellers who have, large amounts of these things laying around, I guess, but you never know how old they are, and some of them, they show up and the battery's dead. So having that replaceable battery, I think, is really awesome.
Yeah, that's full of win. I'm really looking forward to. This looks like it's going to be a fairly inexpensive. This is what they should have done back in the day. Put in a coin cell battery. It's just so obviously this is a huge improvement on the overall design. It's a no-brainer that this is going to be the thing that everybody's going to want to put into their computers.
Yep, totally agree. Again, this comes from Reactive Micro and Ultimate Apple II. They got together and collaborated again and came up with a great product. They haven't announced pricing or a ship date yet, but I know the models that we got look fairly complete, and I imagine it won't be long before you people out there can buy them as well.
Did you get just the 1.0 one?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, I also got the 1.1 that's got a few design changes in it.
Oh, he's so lucky.
Oh, yeah, I am. Anyway, it looks like it's a solid product. I don't think it'll be that expensive.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is that it's not like a complex thing. You pop it in there, and it's just like the old ones. You go in with your no slot clock disc, and it'll see it, and you can adjust the time, and you're off and running. And now the other product we have is a little bit more complex. And what are your thoughts on the scalable oscillator for the Transwarp GS?
Well, after I got my PhD in how to set it up, no, it's an interesting device. It's really cool. You put in a nice fast oscillator, and then you can use the switches to kind of change the frequency on the fly. Well, I wouldn't say on the fly, but you can really granularly set the frequency on the oscillator, and anybody who's into tweaking or getting the maximum juice out of their Transwarp GS, this will be something they'll want because they can fine tune it to the quarters?
Yeah, it's a quarter of a megahertz. So you can put it whatever speed you want. Now, It's not something that you can set like, in the Transwarp control panel. That would be the awesomest thing ever, but I don't even know if that's a possibility. So if you want to change speed, you will have to, open your 2GS and go in and fiddle with these dip switches. Now, the dip switches, there's a bank of them, and that sort of, for me anyway, kind of presented a bit of a challenge. What about you?
Yeah, I had to, I'm getting older, so I had to get out the pen light, the magnifying glass, and a toothpick to set those switches.
Yeah, and they're kind of at a sort of a weird angle. They're I don't know if they're upside down, but when you look at them, it's a challenge. Now, I got a set of instructions, fortunately, from Henry. There's like a little equation that you can do if you really, for you really math geek types out there, that can tell you which pins, which switch needs to be in which position for the speed you want. But fortunately, Henry sent along these instructions that have a nice chart. It shows every speed on the quarter of a megahertz and what the settings are automatically, which for a guy like me is a lot easier.
Yeah, you don't want to lose that chart.
Yeah. Make a copy, make a PDF, post it all over the place. Don't lose that because it can be a little bit maddening. I didn't notice. Now, granted, I'm still working on the older original Transwarp 2GSs. I don't have one of the fancy new ones that's coming from Reactive Micro yet, so I didn't notice, and I guess I wouldn't because it's just an oscillator. Didn't get any. I got about the same speed as before. It's just that I didn't have to go in and dig through the drawer of oscillators and find the one that I wanted. So I have one that goes at about 12.5, and that's as fast as I think that one's ever going to go. And I've got another one that I can get to about 10, and I tested both of those and got about the same results. So.
Yeah, I did as well. The thing about the scalable oscillator, I still had to take it off the board in order to set it. Mm-hmm. Just because like you said earlier, it was at that weird angle, and it's nice to have, so you don't have to have a drawer full of oscillators to try if you're into the overclocking the Transwarp GS. But you're still taking it in and out of the socket. Right.
Yeah, and that's work, and that's wear on the sockets. You'd mentioned a nice term in the email earlier today. You said this is a tweaker's toy, and I definitely agree with that. If you're going to be playing around with speeds a lot, this is great because you don't have to. Where's that 10.75 that I was looking for? But I think for most users, they're going to set it once. They'll find a comfortable speed, kind of play around, and that'll be it. They won't mess with this again.
I think what anyone who buys this should do is they take the chart with the dip switch settings and tape a copy of it to the inside of their case, because that's where they're gonna find it, and that's where they're gonna need it.
That's a really good idea. I think I'm gonna do that as soon as we get off the line here. They haven't announced, again, there's no price on this yet, but it's a fully functioning product. I had no problems with it. It worked great. And so I'm expecting that these will be available for sale soon.
I think they're going to make an announcement probably sometime within the next week.
Yeah, and I really hope, really hope that we'll be able to get our hands on the brand new Transwarp GS that they've cloned. Do you have any more information on that than what you posted over on a2central.com?
Well, Henry told me that he's planning on sending out a board to you and I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't wait.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, me too. Did he happen to tell you about anything behind the scenes or what they had to do to crack those gals that have been such a pain so far?
Nothing specifically. I knew they had to shave an original Transwarp down so that they could document it and send it off to China. Henry, Jeff Body, and a few other people. They're all working together on getting these clones out to us, and I think Henry and Jeff Body are probably the most knowledgeable people about the Transwarp on the planet right now, aside from original applied engineering people.
Yeah, no kidding. There's a wealth of knowledge there, and I think it's paying off in dividends for Apple II users.
Well, But the thing is if you do a little bit of calculating, if you look up the parts, this is still going to be kind of an expensive board because there's so much silicon on it. What's going to really happen what they're going to have to do in order to get this board, cheap, is at some point it's going to have to probably be redesigned.
Yeah, that makes sense. But still, I think that beats kind of, trying to outbid all the other Apple II users that are hungry on eBay and having these boards go up to $500, $600, $700.
Well, possibly. It's nice. This is going to make it more available to more people.
Sure. Right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sean. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. And for you listeners out there, I think Sean's going to have a post up about this probably on the same day that we go live with the show. So some great stuff to look forward to from Reactive Micro and Ultimate Apple II.
It's great talking to you, Mike.
You too, Sean.
Cool. Well, I think that wraps up our tech segment, and I think that actually wraps up our show as well.
Yeah, it's been another long one, but I think it's been a good one. Thank you, Mark, for joining us. We've had a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on. This is great, and you can consider me an avid listener.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and until next month, this has been Open Apple.
This has been the Open Apple Podcast. Subscribe to us in iTunes or visit us at open-apple.net, where you can browse our extensive catalogue of past episodes or read our blog. If you like what you've heard today, or even if you didn't, your comments, questions or ideas are always welcome. Send them to feedback at open-apple.net.
What are your thoughts on that?
Who, me?
Smooth. That was good radio.